Hey friends, welcome to the Horror Sleep. Almost 90% of you watching aren't subscribed. If you enjoy these true park ranger horror stories, hit that subscribe button and leave a like. It really helps the channel. Oh, and where are you watching from tonight? Let me know in the comments. My name is Silas Rennard. I've been working as a park ranger at Green Mountain National Forest in Vermont for most of the last 7 years. This is stunning country. It's the kind of place that lets you forget all about the maelstrom of the real world. There's thick forests of maple and birch trees. There's the icy clear water that tumbles down from the mountains. There are lakes that are so calm and still, they might as well be made of glass. Most of the time, I feel like the luckiest man on earth to get to call this place my workplace. But then, what happened last October, I'm not so sure. My own duty cycles are mostly night shifts, which puts me out into the woods just as the visitors are settling into their tents or RVs for the night. This is a quieter time of day than the daytime shifts, and that's the way I like it. There's a certain peace in being alone in the woods at night. Just you and the sound of the flashlight in your hand, and the creatures of the night for company. Or at least, there was. The incident I'm about to share with you began on a Tuesday evening in mid-October. The fall foliage was at its peak, which meant we'd had a decent influx of leaf peepers during the day. But by the time I started my shift at 8 p.m., most of them had cleared out. I was assigned to patrol the northern sector that night, specifically the area around Echo Lake. It's one of the more remote sections of the park, accessible only by a narrow dirt road that winds through about 6 miles of dense forest. Now, Echo Lake isn't particularly large, maybe 2 miles across at its widest point, but it's deep and it's old, and there's something about the way the surrounding mountains cradle it that makes the whole area feel isolated, even when you're standing right at the water's edge in broad daylight. At night, with fog rolling off the water like it usually does in October, the place takes on an entirely different character, the kind that makes you understand why our ancestors told stories about spirits and forbidden places. I started my patrol just as the sun was disappearing behind the western ridge. The temperature had already dropped into the low 40s, and I could see my breath forming small clouds in the beam of my flashlight. I drove the service road slowly, checking the established campsites one by one. Most were empty, which wasn't surprising for a Tuesday night this late in the season. But then I reached Campsite 7, about half a mile from the lake shore, and found a car. It was a newer model Honda CR-V with Massachusetts plates. The vehicle was locked, and when I peered through the windows with my flashlight, I could see camping gear in the back. Tent, sleeping bags, cooler, the usual stuff. Nothing seemed out of place, but something about the scene made me pause. The campsite itself showed signs of recent use. There was a fire ring with fresh ash, and I could see where a tent had been pitched in the designated area, based on the compressed grass and a few tent stakes still in the ground. But the tent was gone. The gear was in the car, and there was no one around. I called out a few times, announcing myself as a park ranger. Nothing. The forest was unusually quiet, too. No birds, no rustling in the underbrush, just the distant sound of water lapping against the shore and the faint whisper of wind through the trees. I made a note of the license plate and the campsite number in my log, then continued my patrol. It wasn't entirely unusual for campers to pack up and go for an evening hike, especially if they were trying to catch a sunset view from one of the nearby ridges. Still, something about it bothered me in a way I couldn't quite articulate. The road descended gradually as I continued toward the lake, the forest growing denser on either side. The fog was starting to roll in, which was typical for this time of year. Cold air meeting warmer water creates these thick banks of mist that can reduce visibility to just a few feet. I'd been through it dozens of times before, but that night it seemed particularly heavy. When I reached the lake access point, I parked and got out to do a quick visual sweep of the shore. The fog was so thick I could barely see 20 feet in front of me, but I could hear the water clearly, that gentle, lapping sound that's normally so peaceful. I stood there for a moment, letting my eyes adjust to the limited visibility, and that's when I noticed something odd. There were footprints in the mud at the water's edge. 2 sets of them, clearly visible in the beam of my flashlight. They appeared fresh, the edges still sharp and well-defined. What caught my attention was that both sets seemed to be heading toward the water, but I couldn't see where they came out again. I followed them as far as I could, my boots sinking slightly into the soft mud, and watched as they led directly into the lake and disappeared beneath the surface. Now, I want you to understand something. I've seen plenty of strange things working as a ranger. People do odd things in national forests. They swim at inappropriate times, they wander off trail. They make decisions that seem baffling to anyone with common sense. So, finding footprints leading into a lake wasn't necessarily alarming on its own. But there was something about these prints that struck me as wrong. For one thing, they were perfectly parallel, like 2 people walking side by side, matching each other step for step. The stride length was identical, the depth of each impression was the same, and they maintained that perfect parallel alignment all the way to the water's edge. It was the kind of precision you'd expect from soldiers marching in formation, not from casual hikers or swimmers. I pulled out my radio and called it in to dispatch. "This is Ranger Renard. I'm at Echo Lake Access Point. I've got what looks like fresh footprints leading into the water. 2 individuals, no signs of exit. Might want to note it in case we get a missing persons report." The dispatcher, a woman named Carol, who'd been working the desk for longer than I'd been alive, acknowledged the call with her usual calm efficiency. "Copy that, Silas. I'll make a note. You seeing any personal effects? Clothing, shoes, anything like that?" I swept my light across the shore again. "Negative, just the prints. Probably swimmers," Carol said. "Though it's a cold night for it. Keep an eye out on your way back through." I agreed and signed off. But something about her explanation didn't sit right with me. The water temperature in Echo Lake this time of year hovers around 50 degrees. Possible to swim in, sure, but you'd want a wetsuit. And where were their shoes? I looked around more carefully, checking the nearby rocks and the small wooden dock that extended about 15 feet into the water. Nothing. I was about to head back to my truck when I heard it. A sound that made every hair on the back of my neck stand up. It was a splash, not particularly loud, but distinct, and it came from somewhere out in the fog-shrouded lake, maybe 50 yards from shore. "Hello?" I called out, my voice seeming to die in the thick air. "Park ranger here. If you're swimming, I need you to come back to shore. Water's too cold for safe swimming this time of year." Silence. Then another splash, this one from a slightly different location. Closer, maybe. I pulled out my flashlight and aimed it toward the sound, but the beam just reflected off the fog, creating a diffuse glow that revealed nothing. I tried again, calling out with more authority this time. "I need you to respond if you can hear me. Come back to shore now." For a long moment there was nothing. Then I heard what sounded like footsteps, not in the water, but on the shore. Behind me. I spun around, my hand instinctively moving to the pepper spray on my belt. The beam of my flashlight cut through the fog, illuminating the muddy shore and the edge of the tree line beyond. There was no one there. But in the mud, illuminated clearly in my light, I could see new footprints. They hadn't been there 30 seconds ago. I was certain of it. These prints were different from the ones I'd seen leading into the water. They were deeper, like someone had been running. And they led from the water's edge directly toward the tree line, following a path that would have required whoever made them to pass within 5 feet of where I was standing. I should have seen them. I should have heard them. But I hadn't. My heart was pounding now, and I could feel that primal fear response kicking in, the one that tells you something is fundamentally wrong with your surroundings. I backed up slowly toward my truck, keeping my light on the tree line. The footprints continued into the forest, disappearing into the undergrowth. I made it back to the truck and got inside, locking the doors even though part of me felt ridiculous for doing it. I radioed Carol again, trying to keep my voice steady as I reported what I'd just experienced. To her credit, she didn't dismiss my concern. "You want me to send backup?" she asked. I thought about it. What would I tell another ranger? That I'd seen footprints appear out of nowhere? That I'd heard splashing but couldn't see anyone? It sounded absurd, even in my own head. "Negative," I finally said. "I'm going to continue the patrol, but I want this logged. Something's not right out here." "Copy that. Be careful, Silas." I put the truck in gear and continued along the service road, following it as it curved away from the lake and back into the dense forest. My mind was racing, trying to find a rational explanation for what I'd just experienced. Maybe there had been people in the water and I just hadn't seen them in the fog. Maybe the footprints had been there all along and I'd missed them on my first pass. Maybe the sounds I'd heard were just the natural acoustics of the lake playing tricks on me. But even as I tried to convince myself of these possibilities, I knew they didn't add up. Those prints hadn't been there. I'd walked right past that spot, had been standing on that exact patch of shore, and the way they'd appeared, the depth and clarity of them, suggested someone had moved past me at a dead run. I would have heard that. I would have felt it. The road climbed gradually as it wound back toward the interior campsites, and I was grateful to be putting distance between myself and the lake. The fog thinned out as I gained elevation, and by the time I reached Campsite 5, I could see stars beginning to appear through gaps in the canopy above. Campsite 5 was empty, as I'd expected. I was about to continue on when my headlights caught something that made me stop. There, on the picnic table at the center of the campsite, was a wet footprint. I got out slowly, approached the table with my flashlight raised. The print was fresh, water still beading on the wooden surface. It was a right foot, adult-sized, and it pointed toward the forest. I looked around, checking the ground for more prints, but the pine needle-covered earth revealed nothing. "Hello," I called out. "This is Park Ranger Renard. I need you to show yourself." The forest remained silent. I examined the footprint more closely. There was something odd about it that I couldn't quite identify at first. Then it hit me. The toes. The impression left by the toes was too deep, too pronounced. It was as if whoever made this print had been standing on their toes, putting all their weight on the front of their foot. I thought about the footprints at the lake, how perfectly parallel they'd been. About the splashing sounds and the running prints that had appeared behind me. And now this, a single footprint placed deliberately on a picnic table at an empty campsite. It felt less like evidence of someone's presence, and more like a message. Like someone was showing me that they were there, that they were aware of me, but they didn't want to be seen. I backed away from the table and returned to my truck. My hands were shaking as I reached for the radio. "Carol, this is Renard. I'm at Campsite 5. I've got another situation here." "Go ahead, Silas." I described what I'd found, and I could hear the concern in her voice when she responded. "Silas, I think you should come back to the station. We can send someone else to finish the patrol." Part of me wanted to accept that offer. To drive back to the well-lit ranger station, write up my report, and let someone else deal with whatever was happening out here. But another part of me, the part that had spent 7 years learning every trail and campsite in this forest, refused to be scared off. "Negative," I said. "I'm going to check the remaining campsites. If I don't report back in an hour, send someone after me." "Silas, I'll be fine, Carol. Just stay on the radio." I ended the transmission before she could argue further and put the truck back in gear. The road ahead twisted through dense forest, and my headlights created strange shadows that seemed to move independently of the trees casting them. Every few hundred yards, I'd slow down and scan the roadside with my spotlight, looking for anything out of place. Campsite 6 was empty and undisturbed. I almost didn't bother getting out, but procedure required a physical check of each site. I did a quick walk around, confirmed there were no tents, no vehicles, no signs of occupation. As I was heading back to the truck, something made me stop and turn around. There, at the edge of the campsite where the clearing met the forest, I could see movement. Not the obvious movement of a person or animal, but something subtle. Like the air itself was shifting, creating distortions in the shadows. I aimed my flashlight at the spot and froze. For just a moment, maybe 2 or 3 seconds, I could swear I saw a figure standing there. Tall, indistinct, visible only as an absence of light rather than a presence. Then I blinked, and it was gone. My rational mind tried to explain it away as a trick of shadows and fog, but my instincts, honed by years of working in the wilderness, were screaming at me that I was being watched. More than that, I was being followed. Whatever was out there had been tracking my patrol, moving parallel to me through the forest, leaving signs of its presence at each stop I made. I got back in the truck and locked the doors, then sat there for a moment trying to steady my breathing. I'd never felt this kind of fear in the forest before. I'd encountered bears, had standoffs with aggressive visitors, had dealt with medical emergencies and search and rescue operations. But this was different. This was the kind of fear that lives in the oldest part of your brain, the part that remembers when humans were prey animals hiding from things in the dark. The radio crackled. "Silas, you still there?" It was Carol, and I could hear the worry in her voice. "Yeah," I managed. "I'm here. Listen, I've been thinking about those footprints you described at the lake. The parallel ones? I think I might know what you're dealing with." "Go ahead," I said, gripping the radio tighter than necessary. Carol's voice came through with that particular quality that suggested she was choosing her words carefully. "How long have you been working Green Mountain, Silas?" 7 years. "About that, yeah. So you weren't here for the incident in 2009, before your time." She paused, and I could hear papers rustling in the background. "We don't talk about it much. Not officially anyway. But there was a situation at Echo Lake that year. Late October, actually. Same time of year as now." I waited, watching the shadows beyond my windshield shift and move with the wind. Or at least, I hoped it was the wind. "2 hikers went missing," Carol continued. "A couple from New Hampshire. They'd reserved Campsite 7 for a 3-day stay. When they didn't check out, and their car was still there after an extra day, we sent rangers to investigate. Found the campsite abandoned, all their gear still in the vehicle. Just like what you saw tonight." My mouth went dry. "Did you find them?" "Eventually. Took 3 days. Search and rescue found them wandering on the far side of the lake about 5 miles from their campsite. They were hypothermic, dehydrated, and, well, they weren't quite right. Mentally, I mean. What happened to them?" "That's the thing, Silas. They couldn't tell us. Or wouldn't, we never figured out which. They kept saying they'd gone for an evening walk along the shore and got turned around in the fog. But here's what bothered everyone at the time. Both of them told the exact same story, word for word. Same details, same phrasing, like they'd rehearsed it. And when the lead ranger pressed them on certain details, they'd just repeat the same sentences over again. Like a recording." I thought about the parallel footprints I'd seen at the lake shore. The perfect alignment, the identical stride length. "Carol, what exactly are you saying?" She was quiet for a moment. "I'm saying that if you're seeing the same patterns, The same kind of signs that were documented back then. Maybe you should consider coming back to the station, at least until morning. We can go out with a full team in daylight. I looked at the clock on my dashboard. It was barely 10 p.m. I still had 6 hours left on my shift. But more importantly, I still had that CRV with Massachusetts plates to think about. Somewhere out there, probably at or near Echo Lake, were the owners of that vehicle. If they were in trouble, if they were experiencing whatever those hikers in 2009 had experienced, I couldn't just leave them. I need to check campsite 7 again, I said. That CRV is still bothering me. But after that, yeah, I'll come back. Silas, I'll be careful, I promise. I started the truck before Carol could argue further and began the drive back toward the lake. The road seemed longer than it had earlier, as if the forest itself had expanded in the darkness. My headlights carved out a tunnel through the trees, but beyond that limited cone of light, the world was absolutely black. As I drove, I found myself thinking about what Carol had said. 2 hikers, found wandering, telling identical stories in identical words. It reminded me of something I'd read once about shock and trauma, how sometimes people's memories can become fixed on certain details, playing them back like a broken record. But Carol had said both hikers told the same story, not just similar stories. That was different. That was wrong. I passed campsite 6, then 5. The wet footprint on the picnic table at 5 would still be there, I knew. Physical evidence that something had been moving through these campsites. But evidence of what? A person? Multiple people? Or something else entirely? The question that kept nagging at me was the simplest one. If someone was out here playing games, trying to scare me or other rangers, why? What possible motivation could they have? This was federal land, which meant that messing with a park ranger was a federal offense. And the isolation of the area meant that whoever was doing this had to be comfortable operating in deep wilderness at night, which limited the suspect pool considerably. Unless, of course, it wasn't a person at all. I dismissed that thought as soon as it formed. 7 years of ranger work had taught me that 99% of the strange things people experience in forests have rational explanations. Weird sounds are usually animals. Strange lights are usually campfires or flashlights seen from a distance. Feelings of being watched are usually just the natural anxiety that comes from being alone in the wilderness. But that other 1%. That was the percentage that kept you up at night. I reached campsite 7 and pulled in slowly, my headlights sweeping across the empty site. The CRV was still there, exactly as I'd left it. I got out of my truck and approached the vehicle, playing my flashlight beam across its windows. Everything looked the same. The camping gear was still in the back, undisturbed. I tried the doors again, even though I knew they were locked. Then I walked around to the front and placed my hand on the hood. It was cold. The vehicle hadn't been driven in hours. The campsite itself was just as empty as before. The fire ring, the compressed grass where the tent had been, the abandoned tent stakes. But as I played my light across the scene, something new caught my attention. There, in the dirt near the fire ring, were more footprints. I approached them carefully, crouching down to examine them better. These weren't the parallel prints from the lake shore, nor were they the running prints that had appeared behind me. These were different. They started at the edge of the campsite, near where the forest began, and they led toward the fire ring. Then they stopped, just stopped, as if whoever made them had simply disappeared into thin air right next to the cold ashes. No, I realized, looking more closely. They didn't just stop. They ended at a single footprint that was deeper than the others, pressed into the ground with enough force to crack the dry earth around it. And from that point, a new set of prints began, leading back toward the forest. But these new prints were different. They were the same size and shape as the first set, but they were spaced farther apart, much farther apart, like whoever made them had suddenly started taking impossibly long strides, or like they'd started running on their toes, barely touching the ground. I stood up slowly, my hand instinctively moving to my pepper spray again. The forest around me was utterly silent. No wind, no animals, no insects, just a heavy, oppressive quiet that seemed to absorb all sound. "Hello?" I called out, my voice sounding thin and inadequate. "This is Park Ranger Renard. If you're out there, I need you to respond." Nothing. I pulled out my radio. "Carol, I'm back at Campsite 7. The vehicle is still here, no sign of the occupants. I'm finding more unusual footprints. I think I need to do a sweep of the immediate area." "Negative, Silas. Come back to the station. We'll organize a proper search party for first light." She was right, I knew. Conducting a search alone at night in unfamiliar terrain was dangerous and went against every protocol we had. But something about this situation felt urgent. Those footprints, the abandoned campsite, the parallel tracks at the lake, it all added up to something very wrong. And every instinct I had was telling me that waiting until morning might be too late. "I'm just going to do a quick sweep of the trail to the lake," I said. 15 minutes, maybe 20. If the campers went down there and got disoriented in the fog, they might still be close by. Carol sighed. "Fine. But you check in every 5 minutes. If you miss even one check-in, I'm sending every ranger we have out there. Understood?" "Understood." I clipped the radio back to my belt and grabbed my larger flashlight from the truck, the one with the powerful beam that could cut through fog and darkness like a knife. Then I found the trailhead, marked by a weathered wooden sign that read Echo Lake, 0.5 miles. The trail was narrow, barely wide enough for 2 people to walk side by side. The forest pressed in close on both sides, and the canopy overhead blocked out even the faint starlight. My flashlight beam revealed a path carpeted with pine needles and fallen leaves, winding downhill toward the invisible lake below. I started walking, sweeping my light from side to side, looking for any sign that someone had passed this way recently. The trail was well maintained, which made it easier to spot disturbances, and I found them almost immediately. Broken branches at about chest height, snapped cleanly as if someone had pushed through them in a hurry. Scuff marks in the dirt where someone had slipped or stumbled, and there, pressed into a patch of soft earth at the side of the trail, another footprint. Just one, perfectly clear and distinct. A right foot again, with that same odd emphasis on the toes. I keyed my radio. "First check-in, I'm on the trail heading toward the lake. Found evidence that someone came this way recently." "Copy that," Carol responded. 4 more minutes. I continued down the trail, moving more slowly now. The slope was getting steeper, and I could hear water somewhere ahead. The fog was rolling back in, wisps of it drifting between the trees like searching fingers. That's when I heard the voice. It was faint, barely audible over the sound of my own footsteps. A woman's voice calling out. I couldn't make out the words, but the tone was clear. Distress, fear, maybe even panic. "Hello," I shouted back. "Park Ranger here. Keep calling out so I can find you." The voice came again, a little clearer this time. "Help, please, lost." I picked up my pace, following the sound. The trail curved sharply to the left, and suddenly the trees opened up, and I was at the lake shore. The fog was thick here, reducing visibility to maybe 10 feet. But I could see the water, dark and still, reflecting my flashlight beam like black glass. "Where are you?" I called out. "Keep talking to me." "Here." The voice seemed to come from my right, somewhere along the shore. Can't find..." I moved toward the sound, my boots sinking slightly into the muddy shore. The fog was so thick now I could barely see my own feet. I swept my flashlight beam back and forth, trying to penetrate the gray wall in front of me. "Keep talking," I said. "I'm coming to you." And then I stopped, my heart hammering in my chest, because I'd realized something that made my blood run cold. The voice I was hearing, the voice I was following, it wasn't coming from one location, it was coming from everywhere at once. From my right, from my left, from behind me and in front of me. The same voice, the same words, repeating from multiple directions simultaneously. "Here, here, here. Can't find. I spun around, my light cutting through the fog in wild arcs. There was no one there. No shapes in the mist, no shadows moving through the gray. Just that voice, echoing from every direction, repeating those same fragments of sentences over and over. My radio crackled. "Silas, second check-in, you there?" I fumbled for the radio with shaking hands. "Carol, something's wrong. I'm hearing voices, but there's no one here. Multiple voices, same words, coming from everywhere. Silas, get out of there. Now. Don't wait, don't investigate. Just get back to your truck and leave." The urgency in her voice cut through my confusion. I started backing away from the water, keeping my light pointed ahead of me. The voices continued, growing louder. "Lost, lost, lost. Help, help, help." And then, through the fog directly ahead of me, I saw them. 2 figures standing at the water's edge. They were maybe 15 feet away, barely visible through the mist. They stood perfectly still, perfectly parallel to each other, and even though I couldn't see their faces clearly, I knew they were looking at me. "Hello?" I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "Are you the campers from Site 7? The figures didn't respond. They just stood there motionless, and as I watched, I realized they weren't quite standing on the shore. They were standing in the water, about ankle deep, but there were no ripples around their legs. No disturbance in the water at all. It was as if they were standing on top of it rather than in it. I took a step backward, then another. The figures remained motionless. Then, in perfect unison, they both took a step forward, then another, moving toward me with that same parallel precision I'd seen in the footprints. "Carol," I said into the radio, not taking my eyes off the approaching figures. "I need backup. Echo Lake, shore access point. I need it now." "Already on the way. ETA 20 minutes. Silas, are you in immediate danger?" The figures took another synchronized step forward. They were maybe 10 feet away now, and I could start to make out more details through the fog. They were both wearing hiking clothes, both had the same build, the same height, but their movements were too synchronized, too perfect. No 2 people move that identically unless they've trained extensively to do so. "I don't know," I said honestly, "but I'm getting out of here." I turned and ran. Behind me, I heard splashing. The sound of multiple feet hitting water in rapid succession, perfectly timed. I didn't look back, I just ran, my flashlight beam bouncing wildly as I sprinted back up the trail toward Campsite 7. The path seemed longer than I remembered, twisting through the darkness like a maze. My lungs burned from the cold air, and my legs were already starting to ache from the steep uphill grade. But the splashing sounds behind me kept me moving, kept pushing me forward even when I thought my legs might give out. I burst out of the tree line and into Campsite 7, immediately veering toward my truck. That's when I realized I couldn't hear the splashing anymore. I couldn't hear anything behind me except my own ragged breathing and the pounding of my heart. I stopped, hands on my knees, gasping for air. Slowly, I turned around and pointed my flashlight back at the trailhead. Nothing. The path was empty, disappearing into darkness and fog. Whatever had been following me, if anything actually had been, was gone now. Or maybe it was just waiting. I got into my truck and locked the doors, then sat there for a moment trying to make sense of what I'd just experienced. The logical part of my brain was screaming that there had to be a rational explanation. Maybe the figures I'd seen were the missing campers, disoriented by the fog and cold. Maybe they'd been moving in unison because they were holding on to each other for support. Maybe the voices I'd heard were acoustic tricks caused by the fog and the shape of the lake basin. But even as I tried to rationalize it, I knew those explanations didn't fit. Those figures had been standing in the water, on the water. And the voices hadn't just been echoes. They'd been coming from different locations simultaneously, saying the exact same things at the exact same time. My radio crackled. "Silas, you there? Please respond." "I'm here," I managed. "I'm at campsite 7, in my truck. I'm okay. Backup is 15 minutes out. Stay in your vehicle with the doors locked. Do you understand?" "Yeah, I understand." I sat there in the darkness, my hand still gripping the flashlight even though I wasn't using it anymore. The campsite beyond my windshield looked normal enough. The fire ring, the picnic table, the CRV parked where it had been all evening. But I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched, that somewhere out there in the darkness, those parallel figures were standing, waiting. That's when I noticed something about the CRV that I hadn't registered before. Its windows were fogging up from the inside. Little condensation patterns were forming on the glass, the kind you get when there's a temperature difference between the inside and outside of a vehicle. The kind you get when there's someone breathing inside. I grabbed my radio. "Carol, the suspect vehicle. There might be someone inside it. The windows are fogging." "Do not approach the vehicle," she said immediately. "Wait for backup." "But if the campers are in there, wait for backup, Silas. That's an order." I put down the radio and stared at the CRV. The fog on the windows was getting thicker, and as I watched, I saw something that made my skin crawl. In the fog on the driver's side window, someone was drawing, or writing, I couldn't tell which. Slow, deliberate movements, a finger tracing patterns in the condensation from the inside. I should have listened to Carol. I should have stayed in my truck and waited for the other rangers to arrive. But the thought of someone trapped in that vehicle, maybe injured or hypothermic, overrode my better judgment. I grabbed my flashlight and got out of the truck. The night air felt colder than it had earlier, and the fog was starting to creep up from the lake into the campsite. I approached the CRV slowly, keeping my flashlight trained on the windows. The condensation was still there, still had those marks on it. When I got close enough to see clearly, I stopped breathing for a moment. The marks on the window weren't random. They were words, written backward so they could be read from outside. "They're not us." I stood there, frozen, my mind trying to process what I was seeing. Then I heard a sound from inside the vehicle. A tap, like knuckles on glass. It came from the back seat. Slowly, I moved my flashlight beam to the rear window. The glass was heavily fogged, but I could just make out shapes inside. 2 people sitting in the back seat. As my light hit them, they both turned to look at me in perfect unison. I could see their faces now, pressed close to the glass. A man and a woman, both in their 30s, both wearing hiking clothes. Their eyes were wide, terrified, and their mouths were moving, but no sound was coming out. They were trying to tell me something, their lips forming the same words over and over again. Then the woman reached up and started writing on the window again, her finger moving frantically. "Don't let them in." The man beside her pointed behind me. I spun around, my flashlight beam cutting through the fog. 2 figures stood at the edge of the campsite, exactly where the trail emerged from the forest. They stood perfectly parallel to each other, perfectly still, and even though the fog obscured their faces, I could feel them watching me. I backed up against the CRV, fumbling for my radio. "Carol, we have a situation. The campers are in their vehicle. They've locked themselves in, and there are two individuals approaching from the trail. Send everyone. Send everyone now." "Silas, what's happening? Talk to me." "I don't know," I said, watching as the parallel figures took a synchronized step forward. "But whatever these things are, they're not the campers. The campers are here. They're trapped in their car, and they're terrified." The figures took another step forward. In the beam of my flashlight, I could finally see them clearly. They were wearing hiking clothes identical to what the man and woman in the car were wearing. Same jackets, same boots, same everything. But their faces were wrong. Not deformed or monstrous, just wrong in a way that was hard to articulate. Like they were faces that someone had described but never actually seen. And they were smiling. Both of them, the exact same smile. I heard pounding from inside the CRV, the real campers trying to get my attention. The woman was writing on the window again, her message even more frantic. "Keys under mat." I looked down. Sure enough, there was a rubber floor mat lying near the driver's side door. I grabbed it, found the keys underneath, and had them in my hand in seconds. But that meant getting the campers out of the vehicle, which would require unlocking the doors and exposing them to whatever those things were. The figures were closer now, maybe 20 feet away, still moving in that perfect parallel synchronization, still wearing those wrong smiles. I made a decision. I pointed the key fob at the CRV and pressed the unlock button. The locks clicked open with a sound that seemed impossibly loud in the quiet night. Then I pulled open the rear passenger door. "Run!" I shouted at the campers. "Get to my truck, now!" They didn't need to be told twice. The woman scrambled out first, followed immediately by the man. They ran toward my Ranger truck without looking back, and I was right behind them. My flashlight still pointed at the approaching figures, but the figures weren't approaching anymore. They'd stopped, and they were no longer smiling. They were just standing there, watching us with those wrong faces as we fled. We made it to my truck, all 3 of us piling into the cab. I started the engine with shaking hands and threw it into reverse, not caring about procedure or protocol or anything except getting as far away from this campsite as possible. As we backed out onto the service road, I kept my eyes on the rearview mirror. The 2 figures hadn't moved. They just stood there in the middle of the campsite 7, parallel to each other, watching us leave. And as the distance grew and the fog started to obscure them, I could swear I saw them wave. A single, synchronized gesture of farewell, or maybe invitation. "Thank you," the woman beside me gasped. She was crying, shaking violently. Thank you, we've been trapped there for hours. We didn't know what to do." "You're safe now," I said, though I wasn't entirely sure that was true. "Just stay calm. We're going back to the ranger station." The man in the passenger seat was staring straight ahead, his face pale. "They looked exactly like us," he whispered. "Exactly. How is that possible?" "I don't know," I said, honestly, "but we're going to figure it out." My radio crackled. "Silas, I have 3 Rangers entering the north sector now. They're 2 minutes from your location. Status report?" "I have the missing campers," I said. "They're safe. We're heading back to the station. But Carol, those figures at the lake, the Rangers will check it out. Just get those people somewhere safe." I drove faster than I should have on the narrow service road, but I didn't care. Every instinct I had was telling me to put distance between us and Echo Lake. The campers sat in silence, occasionally looking at each other as if confirming the other was real. We were about halfway back to the main road when the woman spoke again. "They followed us," she said quietly, "from the lake. We went for a walk after setting up camp, wanted to see the sunset over the water. But the fog came in so fast and we got turned around. When we finally found our way back to the campsite, they were there, standing next to our car. We thought they were other hikers at first. We even waved to them. 'What happened?' I asked. They waved back," the man said. "Exactly the same way, at exactly the same time, like mirror images. And then they started walking toward us, and that's when we realized." He trailed off, unable to finish the sentence. "Realized what?" "That they were us," the woman finished. "Same height, same clothes, same everything. But the way they moved, the way they looked at us, it was like looking at puppets wearing our faces. We ran back to the car and locked ourselves inside. They didn't try to break in. They just stood there, outside, watching us for hours. Waiting. Waiting for what?" Neither of them answered. We reached the main road and turned toward the ranger station. I could see the lights in the distance, warm and welcoming after the darkness of the forest. My radio continued to crackle with updates from the other rangers. They'd reached Echo Lake, were conducting a sweep of the shoreline and the campsites. So far, they reported, everything seemed normal. No unusual footprints, no figures in the fog, no strange voices. No evidence that any of it had happened at all. By the time we reached the station, there were already 2 police cars in the parking lot. Carol had called them in, knowing that what we were dealing with might be beyond the scope of normal ranger operations. I parked and helped the campers inside, where Carol immediately wrapped them in emergency blankets and started making hot coffee. The police officers, a man and woman from the state patrol, began asking questions. I gave them my report as accurately as I could, knowing full well how it sounded. Parallel figures, synchronized movements, disappearing footprints, voices coming from multiple directions. Even I would have been skeptical if I hadn't experienced it myself. But then the woman camper, whose name I learned was Elodie Hartwick, said something that made everyone in the room go quiet. "This has happened before, hasn't it?" she asked, looking at Carol. "That's why you called the police so quickly. That's why you weren't surprised by what he described." Carol glanced at me, then back at Elodie. "In 2009, she admitted. 2 hikers, same area, same time of year. They reported similar experiences. We found them after 3 days of searching, but they were never quite the same afterward. They moved out of state within a month. Wouldn't talk to us about what they'd experienced beyond the initial reports." "Do you know where they are now?" the male police officer asked. Carol shook her head. "Lost track of them years ago. But I remember the lead ranger at the time saying something that stuck with me. He said those hikers didn't seem afraid of what they'd encountered. They seemed afraid of what they'd almost become." The room fell silent. Outside, I could hear the other rangers returning, their vehicles pulling into the parking lot. They'd finished their sweep of the north sector and found nothing unusual. No figures, no strange footprints, no evidence that anything out of the ordinary had occurred. But I knew what I'd seen. Elodie and her companion, a man named Marcus, knew what they'd seen. And somewhere in the official incident reports from 2009, buried in language that tried to rationalize the irrational, was evidence that we weren't the first to encounter this phenomenon. The police officers finished taking our statements around 2 a.m. By then, Elodie and Marcus had calmed down enough to speak coherently, though they both still looked shaken. The female officer, whose name tag read Patterson, seemed particularly interested in the detail about the figures wearing identical clothing to the campers. "You're absolutely certain," she pressed. "Same jackets, same boots, everything?" "Identical," Marcus confirmed. "Down to a small tear in my sleeve that I'd gotten earlier that day, snagging it on a branch. They had the same tear in the same place." Patterson exchanged a look with her partner. "And you'd never seen these individuals before? They weren't following you earlier in the day, watching you from a distance?" "No," Elodie said firmly. "We would have noticed. The campsite was completely empty when we arrived. We had the whole sector to ourselves. I thought about the CRV I'd first seen at campsite 7 hours earlier. How everything had seemed normal at first glance. But those parallel figures must have already been out there by then, watching from the forest, waiting for nightfall. The question that kept circling in my mind was, waiting for what?" Carol brought over fresh coffee and sat down across from us. She looked tired, older than her 60-some years. "I need to tell you all something," she said quietly. "Something that's not in the official reports." Everyone turned to look at her. "Those hikers in 2009, she continued, "the ones who went missing for 3 days. The lead ranger, Bill Hutchins, he's retired now, living down in Florida. But before he left, he told me something off the record. He said that when they found those hikers, they weren't just disoriented. They were different." "Different how?" Patterson asked. "Physically different. Small things mostly. The woman had a birthmark on her left hand that her family swore had always been on her right. The man was left-handed when he disappeared, but right-handed when they found him. And their memories—" Carol paused, choosing her words carefully. "They could remember everything up until they got lost in the fog. After that, nothing. Just 3 days of blank space. And when they started trying to remember, they'd both say the exact same things, in the exact same words, like they were reading from a script." "You think they were replaced?" Marcus said softly. It wasn't a question. Carol didn't answer directly. "I think something happened to them in those woods. Something that changed them, or maybe something that took their place and sent back copies that weren't quite right." "That's impossible," the male officer, his name tag read Bennett, said reflexively. But his voice lacked conviction. "I thought about those parallel figures standing at the edge of Campsite 7, wearing Marcus and Elodie's faces like masks. What if it's not about replacing people?" I said slowly. "What if it's about becoming them, learning them?" Everyone looked at me. "Think about it," I continued. "Those things at the lake, they weren't perfect copies. They were close, but something was off. The way they moved, the expressions on their faces, like they were practicing, and they had hours to watch Marcus and Elodie, to study their movements, their mannerisms. What if we interrupted them before they were finished?" Elodie's face went pale. "You mean, if we'd stayed in that car longer?" "Maybe nothing would have happened," I said quickly. "We don't know what they wanted. We don't even know what they were." But I was lying, and I think everyone knew it. Those figures had been waiting for something. Maybe for the real Marcus and Elodie to fall asleep. Maybe for them to give up and try to leave the vehicle. Maybe for the chance to get close enough to finish whatever transformation or replacement they'd been attempting. Patterson stood up abruptly. "I need to make some calls. This is beyond our jurisdiction. We need to bring in people with more specialized knowledge." "Like who?" Carol asked. "I don't know yet, but this isn't the first time something like this has been reported in national forests across the country. There are patterns, connections. Someone must be keeping track." She walked outside to make her calls, leaving the rest of us sitting in uncomfortable silence. Through the window, I could see the first hints of dawn starting to lighten the eastern sky. It had been the longest night of my life, and I knew I'd never look at Echo Lake the same way again. Marcus was staring at his hands, turning them over slowly as if seeing them for the first time. "What if it already happened?" he said suddenly. "What if we're not really us anymore? How would we even know?" "You're you," Elodie said firmly, taking his hand. "I can tell. You're you." "How? How can you tell?" She didn't have an answer for that. Bennett cleared his throat. "Listen, I know this is all very unsettling, but let's focus on facts. You were trapped in your vehicle for how long exactly?" 4 hours, Marcus said. "Maybe 5. We lost track of time. And during that entire time you were conscious? Alert?" "Yes. We were too scared to sleep. We kept watching them through the windows. They just stood there, outside, barely moving. Occasionally they'd tilt their heads or shift their weight, but always in perfect sync. It was like watching a looped video." "Did they try to communicate with you at all? Try the door handles, make gestures, anything?" "No," Elodie said. "They just watched. But I kept having this feeling that they were waiting for us to do something, like they needed us to make the first move." I thought about the footprints I'd found, the way they seemed to appear and disappear in impossible patterns. What if they can't act until we act first? What if they need some kind of invitation or permission? Carol looked at me sharply. "Like old stories about vampires? Needing to be invited across the threshold? Maybe. Or maybe it's simpler than that. Maybe they need to observe the complete pattern of our behavior before they can replicate it." They had Marcus and Elodie trapped, stationary, not demonstrating their full range of actions. So the copies couldn't finish forming. They were stuck in this halfway state. "That doesn't explain the parallel footprints you saw at the lake," Carol pointed out. "The ones that were there before Marcus and Elodie even encountered those things." She was right. The timeline didn't quite add up. "Unless, what if there are more of them?" I said. "What if what we encountered tonight wasn't an isolated incident? What if they're all over the forest, waiting at the lake, following different visitors, learning from them?" The room went very quiet. Patterson came back inside, her expression grave. "I made contact with a researcher at the University of Vermont who specializes in unexplained phenomena in wilderness areas. He's heard of similar cases: Wisconsin, Oregon, Alaska, even one case in the Adirondacks. Always near isolated bodies of water, always during fog, always the same pattern of parallel figures appearing." "How many cases?" Carol asked. "At least a dozen documented, probably more that weren't reported. Most of the time, the affected individuals either disappear completely or they're found days later with no memory of what happened. But in every case where people have actually seen the figures and escaped, they report the same things: perfect synchronization, identical appearance to themselves or their companions, and that feeling of wrongness. Like looking at something that's almost human but not quite." "Has anyone figured out what they are?" I asked. Patterson shook her head. "The researcher has theories, but nothing concrete. Some kind of mimetic phenomenon, possibly related to specific geological or atmospheric conditions. The commonality of isolated lakes suggests water might play a role. And the fog seems to be crucial. Every single case occurred during heavy fog conditions." "So we just avoid Echo Lake when it's foggy," Bennett suggested. "Post warnings. Maybe close that section of the park during high-risk conditions." "For how long?" Carol asked. "Forever? This is federal land. We can't just close it indefinitely because of something we can't explain or prove." She was right, of course. What could we say in an official report? That parallel figures that looked like visitors were appearing in the fog? That footprints were manifesting out of nowhere? Without physical evidence, without any clear understanding of what was happening, We had nothing but eyewitness testimony from people who could easily be dismissed as confused or mistaken. But I knew what I'd seen. Marcus and Elodie knew what they'd experienced. And somewhere in Florida, 2 hikers from 2009 knew the truth too, even if they couldn't or wouldn't talk about it. As dawn continued to brighten the sky outside, we eventually agreed on a plan. The section of forest around Echo Lake would be temporarily closed for trail maintenance, giving us time to figure out our next steps. Patterson would continue liaising with the university researcher, and Carol would reach out to the 2009 hikers, if we could locate them, to see if they'd be willing to share more information now that time had passed. Marcus and Elodie were advised to return home and stay in touch, to report any unusual experiences or memories that might surface. They agreed readily, clearly just wanting to put distance between themselves and Green Mountain National Forest. As they were getting ready to leave, Elodie pulled me aside. "That message I wrote on the window," she said quietly, "about not letting them in. I need you to understand something. When I wrote that, I wasn't just talking about the car. I was talking about your mind, about not letting them into your thoughts." "What do you mean?" "When we were sitting there watching them through the glass, I started having these thoughts that didn't feel like my own. Memories of things I'd never done, places I'd never been. And they were coming faster and faster, like something was trying to overwrite who I was. Marcus felt it too. That's why we were so desperate to get out. Not because we thought they'd hurt us physically, but because we were afraid of forgetting ourselves, of becoming something else while still being conscious of the change." She shuddered, and I didn't know what to say. That was somehow more terrifying than anything else I'd heard that night. The idea that those things didn't need to physically replace you. They could do it from inside your own mind. After Marcus and Elodie left, I stayed at the station filling out reports until mid-morning. My shift had technically ended hours ago, but there was too much adrenaline in my system to sleep. I kept thinking about those parallel figures, wondering if they were still out there at Campsite 7, waiting. Around 10 a.m., Carol called me into her office. She looked like she hadn't slept either. "Hutchins called me back," she said without preamble. "The lead ranger from 2009. He's willing to talk, but only off the record. He's scared, Silas. After all these years, he's still scared of what happened." "Did he say anything specific?" "Just one thing. He said that after those hikers were found, he went back to Echo Lake alone to try to figure out what happened. This was against orders, done on his own time, and he saw something that made him immediately request a transfer out of Vermont." "What did he see?" Carol's hand shook slightly as she handed me a piece of paper with an address and phone number. "He wouldn't tell me over the phone, but he said if you wanted to know the truth, really know what we're dealing with, you should call him. He'll tell you things that never made it into any report." I looked at the paper, then back at Carol. "Did he ever go back? To the forest? To Echo Lake?" "No, not once in 15 years. He said once you see them, really see them for what they are, you can't unsee it. And you can't ever be sure that you're still fully yourself. Because they don't just copy your appearance, Silas. They copy your memories, your thoughts, your entire pattern of existence. And sometimes," he said, "you can't tell where you end and they begin." She paused, then added quietly, "He told me something else, too. Those hikers from 2009? They both committed suicide within 6 months of the incident. Different methods, different times, but the same result. Their families reported that in the weeks before they died, both of them had become obsessed with mirrors, with photographs of themselves from before the incident. Like they were trying to remember who they used to be." A chill ran down my spine. "You think those weren't really them?" That the things from the lake successfully replaced them? I don't know. Maybe. Or maybe it's worse than that. Maybe they were still themselves, but they'd seen too much, understood too much about what those things were trying to do, and they couldn't live with that knowledge. I left the station around noon, exhausted but too wired to sleep. The address Carol had given me sat in my pocket like a weight. Part of me wanted to call Hutchins immediately, to get answers. But another part of me, the part that had seen those wrong faces smiling in the fog, wasn't sure I wanted to know more. I drove home through autumn sunlight that seemed too bright after the darkness of the previous night. Everything looked normal. Cars on the road, people going about their business, the world continuing as it always had, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was seeing it all from behind glass, separated by some invisible barrier. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about what Elodie had said, about thoughts that weren't your own, about the slow erosion of identity. I found myself doing what those hikers from 2009 had reportedly done, looking at old photographs of myself, trying to confirm that the person in those images was the same person looking at them now. I never did call Hutchins. Some truths, I decided, aren't meant to be known, at least not by people who want to remain who they are. I still work at Green Mountain National Forest, though I requested a transfer to a different sector. I never patrol near Echo Lake anymore. The area remains officially closed for ongoing trail maintenance, a fiction that's now in its third month with no end in sight. Sometimes other rangers ask me about that night, having heard bits and pieces of the story. I give them the official version, the one that's in the reports. Confused campers, fog-related disorientation, possible mild hypothermia affecting their perception. But late at night, when I'm doing paperwork at the station or sitting alone in my truck on patrol, I sometimes see things in my peripheral vision. Movement that shouldn't be there, synchronized and parallel. I tell myself it's just fatigue, just my mind playing tricks after everything that happened. I tell myself that, but I'm not entirely sure I believe it. And sometimes when I look in the mirror just for a split second, I see something slightly off about my reflection. A delay in movement. An expression that doesn't quite match what I'm feeling. It's always gone before I can focus on it, leaving me wondering if I really saw anything at all, or wondering if I'm still the person who walked into those woods that October night, or if something came back out wearing my face. The worst part is that I'll never know for sure, and neither will you. My name is Callie Morvan, and I've been working as a park ranger in Green Mountain National Forest for about 4 years now. Before that, I did 3 years with the Forest Service out in Montana, so I'm no stranger to wilderness work. I know how to read a trail, how to navigate by landmarks, and how to keep my head when things go sideways. At least, I thought I did. What I'm about to tell you happened last November, during that strange week between Thanksgiving and the first real snowfall of the season. The park was nearly empty, just a handful of die-hard hikers who didn't mind the cold and the shortened days. Most people avoid Vermont in late November. It's too cold for comfortable camping, but not cold enough for winter sports. The trees are bare, the ground is hard, and there's this perpetual dampness in the air that seeps into your bones. I was assigned to night patrol that week, covering the eastern sector of the park. It's about 15 square miles of mixed terrain, some established trails, some backcountry camping areas, and a lot of dense forest that most visitors never see. The night shift is usually quiet work. You check the established campsites, make sure no one's left fires burning, occasionally help a lost hiker find their way back to the trailhead. Simple stuff. The first strange thing I noticed was on Tuesday night, around 11 p.m. I was walking the Hemlock Ridge Trail, one of the more popular routes that winds along a ridgeline for about 3 miles before descending into a valley. The trail is well maintained, with blue blazes painted on trees every 50 feet or so to mark the path. I've walked this trail dozens of times, could probably do it blindfolded. But that night, something was off. I was about a mile in when I noticed a blue blaze on a tree to my right. Nothing unusual about that, except I could have sworn that particular blaze had been on a tree to my left the last time I'd patrolled this section. I stopped and played my flashlight beam over the area, trying to orient myself. The trail looked right. The general terrain matched my mental map. But that blaze was definitely in the wrong place. I pulled out my GPS unit and checked my position. According to the satellite, I was exactly where I should be, right on the trail. But the blaze bothered me. I walked back about 20 feet, found another blaze, and measured the distance between them with my pace count. 53 feet. That was right. The spacing was correct. Maybe I'd just remembered it wrong, I told myself. It was dark, I was tired, and after 4 years of walking the same trails, they all started to blur together sometimes. I made a mental note to check the maintenance logs when I got back to the station and continued my patrol. 20 minutes later, I found another inconsistency. There was a distinctive rock formation at the 2-mile mark on Hemlock Ridge, a cluster of 3 large boulders that hikers often used as a rest spot. The trail was supposed to pass about 10 feet to the left of these boulders. I knew this for certain because I'd stopped there myself dozens of times. But that night, the trail passed to the right of the boulders. Not by much, maybe 15 feet to the right instead of 10 to the left, but the difference was unmistakable. I stood there for a long moment, my flashlight beam playing across the rock face, trying to figure out if I was losing my mind. The GPS confirmed I was on the Hemlock Ridge Trail. The blazes were in the right places, properly spaced, but the trail itself seemed to have shifted, just slightly, just enough to be wrong. I radioed back to the station. "This is Ranger Morvan, checking in from Hemlock Ridge. Quick question. Have there been any trail modifications in the eastern sector recently? Rerouting, maintenance, anything like that?" The dispatcher that night was a guy named Tom, who'd been working at the park longer than I'd been alive. "Negative, Callie. Last maintenance on Hemlock Ridge was back in August, and that was just clearing some deadfall. Why?" "Just something that looked different." "Probably nothing." "You need anything?" "No, I'm good, just checking." I signed off and continued along the trail, but the unease I felt was growing. The forest around me was absolutely silent. No wind, no animals, not even the sound of branches creaking. Just the crunch of my boots on the frozen ground and the occasional scrape of dry leaves. The fog started rolling in around midnight. It came up from the valley below, thick banks of gray mist that reduced visibility to maybe 30 feet. I'd patrolled in fog before, but there was something different about this fog. It seemed to have weight to it, substance. My flashlight beam didn't penetrate it so much as reflect off it, creating a diffuse glow that revealed almost nothing. I was considering turning back and finishing my patrol early when I heard the sound. It came from somewhere ahead of me on the trail, a rhythmic crunching, like footsteps on frozen ground. Someone else was out here. "Hello?" I called out, my voice seeming to die in the thick air. "Park Ranger here. You need any assistance?" The footsteps stopped. Then, after a moment of silence, they started again. But this time they sounded like they were behind me. I spun around, my flashlight cutting through the fog, but I saw nothing. The trail behind me was empty. "This is Park Ranger Morvan," I said again, louder this time. "Please respond if you can hear me." The footsteps continued, but I couldn't pinpoint where they were coming from. They seemed to echo from multiple directions at once, sometimes ahead, sometimes behind, sometimes to either side. The fog was playing tricks with the acoustics, I told myself. Sound doesn't travel normally in fog. It bounces, reflects, creates false impressions of distance and direction. But I've worked in fog before, and this was different. I decided to follow protocol and mark my position. I pulled out a ribbon of bright orange flagging tape and tied it to a nearby tree at eye level. If I got disoriented, I could use these markers to backtrack. Then I continued forward, moving slowly, stopping every few yards to listen. The footsteps had stopped, but the silence that replaced them was somehow worse. I could feel my heart hammering in my chest, could hear my own breathing loud in my ears. Every instinct I had was telling me that something was wrong, but I couldn't identify what. That's when I saw the first footprint. It was in a patch of soft mud at the edge of the trail, clearly visible in my flashlight beam. A boot print, adult-sized, recent. The edges were still crisp, not yet eroded by wind or time. I crouched down to examine it more closely and felt my stomach drop. The footprint was facing the wrong direction. The tread pattern indicated someone had been walking, but the toe of the print was pointing back the way I'd come, while the heel pointed forward along the trail. It was as if someone had been walking backward, or I didn't want to think about the or. I stood up slowly and played my flashlight along the trail. There were more prints, a whole series of them, all pointing the wrong way. They led forward along the trail, but the orientation suggested someone moving backward. And they were fresh, maybe an hour old at most. "Hello?" I called out again. "If you're injured or disoriented, I can help you. Please respond." Nothing. Just that oppressive silence and the weight of the fog pressing in from all sides. I followed the backward-facing prints for about 50 yards, my unease growing with each step. Whoever made these tracks had been moving with purpose, not stumbling or wandering. The stride length was consistent, the prints evenly spaced. Someone had walked this trail backward with confidence, as if they could see where they were going despite facing the wrong direction. Then the prints just stopped. I stood at the end of the trail of footprints, shining my light in all directions, but there was nothing. No indication of where the person had gone. The prints ended in the middle of the trail, and beyond that point, the ground showed no disturbance at all. I marked the spot with another piece of flagging tape and radioed Tom. "I've got something weird out here on Hemlock Ridge. Found a trail of footprints, but they're facing backward, and they just stop. No indication where the person went." "Backward?" Tom's voice crackled with static. "You mean like someone walking backward?" "Exactly like that. And the prints are fresh, maybe an hour old, but there's no one out here." There was a long pause. "Callie, I want you to come back to the station. We can send someone else to finish the patrol." "I'm fine, Tom, just confused, but yeah, I think I'm going to head back. This fog is getting too thick to patrol safely anyway." "Good call. Check in when you reach the trailhead." I turned around to head back, using the flagging tape I'd left as markers. But when I reached the spot where I'd tied the first piece of tape, the one I'd left maybe 10 minutes earlier, it was gone. I was certain this was the right tree. It had a distinctive kink in its trunk, a shape I'd specifically chosen because it was memorable. But the tape wasn't there. I checked the trees nearby. Nothing. I walked back along the trail about 50 feet in each direction, looking for that bright orange tape. Nothing. It was as if it had never existed. My breathing was coming faster now, and I had to consciously work to slow it down. Panic in the wilderness can kill you faster than any animal or weather condition. I pulled out my GPS unit to check my position and felt a new wave of unease wash over me. According to the GPS, I was no longer on Hemlock Ridge Trail. The unit showed me as being about half a mile south, on a completely different trail called Maple Run. But that was impossible. I'd been walking in a straight line the entire time, following the blue blazes, never deviating from the established path. I looked around, searching for those blue blazes, and found them. Right there, painted on the trees, spaced about 50 feet apart. I was definitely on a trail, but the GPS insisted I was somewhere else entirely. I tried to retrace my steps, walking back the way I'd come, counting paces to measure distance. After what should have been about 200 yards, I reached the spot where I'd found the backward-facing footprints. The flagging tape I'd left there was gone too, but the footprints were still there, and now there were more of them. The trail I'd seen earlier, the one that had stopped abruptly in the middle of the path, now continued. The backward-facing prints led farther along the trail, as if someone had walked past while I'd been gone and then returned, adding to the existing trail of wrong-way tracks. I stood there in the fog, trying to process what I was seeing. Someone was out here with me, someone who walked backward with perfect confidence, someone who was removing my trail markers, someone who could apparently move without making any sound at all. That's when I heard the breathing. It came from somewhere to my right, in the forest off the trail. Slow, steady breaths, loud enough to be clearly audible over the ambient silence. I swung my flashlight toward the sound, but the beam just reflected off the fog, revealing nothing. "I know you're there," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "I'm a park ranger. You need to show yourself." The breathing continued, unchanging. In, out, with the mechanical regularity of someone sleeping. But there was something wrong about it, something that made my skin crawl. The rhythm was too perfect, too measured. No natural breathing is that consistent. I took a step backward, toward the center of the trail, and the breathing moved. It wasn't that the person making the sound moved. It was as if the sound itself shifted, relocating to a different part of the forest. Now it came from my left, with that same steady, unnatural rhythm. "This isn't funny," I said, and I could hear the fear creeping into my voice despite my best efforts. "You're in violation of park regulations. You need to reveal yourself immediately." The breathing stopped. The silence that followed was absolute. No wind, no animals, no distant traffic sounds from the highway that ran along the park's western boundary. Just nothing. As if the world had been wrapped in cotton and all sound had been absorbed. Then I heard footsteps again, but this time they were running. Fast, irregular footsteps, coming from somewhere ahead of me on the trail. But as I listened, trying to identify the direction, I realized they were getting fainter instead of louder. Someone was running away from me at high speed, but the sound was fading as if they were moving away at an impossible rate. I didn't wait to investigate further. I turned and ran back the way I'd come, or at least the direction I thought I'd come from. My flashlight beam bounced wildly as I ran, illuminating brief flashes of trees and trail and fog. Behind me, I thought I could hear something following, but I didn't stop to check. I ran for what felt like an eternity, but was probably only 5 minutes. My lungs burned from the cold air, and my legs ached from the uneven terrain. But I didn't slow down. I needed to get back to the trailhead, back to my truck, back to lights and radio contact and the comforting solidity of the ranger station. When I finally stopped to catch my breath, I realized 2 things. First, I had no idea where I was. The fog was so thick I could barely see 10 feet in any direction, and in my panic, I'd lost track of the trail markers. Second, my radio was missing. I grabbed at my belt where it should have been clipped, but found only the empty holster. I must have lost it while running. I pulled out my flashlight, thankfully still attached to my gear by a cord, and tried to get my bearings. The ground beneath my feet was still trail, packed dirt with the characteristic wear pattern of regular foot traffic. I was on a trail at least. But which one? I checked my GPS unit again, and what I saw made no sense. According to the satellite reading, I was now on the northern edge of the park, miles from where I should have been. But I'd only run for 5 minutes, maybe covered half a mile at most. There was no way I could have traveled that far in that time, unless the GPS was wrong. Or unless I'd been running longer than I thought and had somehow become disoriented. Temporal distortion is a known symptom of panic. People often lose track of time when they're frightened. Maybe I'd been running for 20 minutes, or 30, or even longer. I tried to remember the park map, to figure out what trails were in the northern sector, but my mind was blank, wiped clean by adrenaline and fear. I've spent 4 years memorizing every trail, every landmark, every backcountry camping area in this park. But standing there in the fog, I couldn't recall a single detail. That's when I saw the light. It was maybe 50 yards ahead, a soft glow filtering through the fog. Orange and warm like firelight. Someone had made a camp. I should have been relieved. Company, another human being. Someone who could help me orient myself and get back to the trailhead. But something about that light made me hesitate. Who camps in November? Who camps off-trail in fog this thick, without any proper clearing? I approached slowly, trying to make as little noise as possible. As I got closer, I could make out more details. There was definitely a fire, and near it, a tent. A small backpacking tent, green, with a rainfly properly secured. Someone knew what they were doing. This was an experienced camper's setup. "Hello?" I called out softly. "Park ranger here. I'm coming into your camp. Don't be alarmed." No response. The fire crackled quietly and I could see shadows dancing on the tent's wall, suggesting there was a light source inside. A lantern, probably. But no one came out to greet me. I stepped into the small clearing and immediately noticed something odd. There were no footprints around the camp. The ground was soft enough that my boots left clear impressions, but around the tent and fire ring, the earth was completely undisturbed. It was as if the tent and fire had materialized here without anyone walking around to set them up. "Hello?" I tried again, louder this time. "I need assistance. I'm lost and my radio isn't working. Can you help me?" The tent flap was closed, but I could see the silhouette of someone sitting inside, backlit by the lantern. They were perfectly still, not moving or responding to my voice. I reached for my pepper spray, unsnapping the holster. Something was very wrong here. "Sir or ma'am, I need you to come out of the tent. This is an official request from a park ranger." The figure inside the tent moved suddenly, standing up in one fluid motion. But they didn't open the flap. They just stood there, a dark shape against the lantern light, perfectly still again. My hand was shaking as I reached toward the tent flap. Every instinct I had was screaming at me not to open it, to turn around and walk away, but I needed to know. I needed to understand what was happening. I grabbed the zipper and pulled it down in one quick motion. The tent was empty. Completely empty. No sleeping bag, no gear, no lantern, but I could still see the glow of light from inside, casting my shadow on the ground behind me. I waved my hand in front of where the light seemed to be coming from, and my shadow moved accordingly. But there was no light source. No lantern, no headlamp, nothing that could be producing that warm orange glow. I backed away from the tent, my heart hammering so hard I thought it might break a rib. The fire was still crackling, and I looked at it more closely. The flames moved, created heat that I could feel on my face, consumed the wood in the fire ring. But when I looked at the ground around the fire, there was no ash, no charred remnants of earlier logs. The fire was burning, but it wasn't leaving any evidence that it had been burning. I turned and ran, again. I had no plan, no direction, just a desperate need to get away from that impossible camp. My flashlight beam bounced wildly as I crashed through the undergrowth, no longer caring about staying on the trail. I just needed distance between myself and that tent, that fire, that empty glow. I don't know how long I ran this time. When I finally stopped, my lungs screaming for air, I found myself in a small clearing I didn't recognize. The fog was starting to thin here, and I could see stars overhead through gaps in the mist. The sight of them, those familiar constant points of light, helped calm my racing thoughts. I sank down onto a fallen log and tried to think rationally. I was lost, that much was clear. My radio was gone, my GPS was giving impossible readings, and I'd just encountered something that couldn't exist. But I was still alive, still uninjured. I just needed to wait for dawn, which was maybe 4 hours away. Once the sun came up and the fog burned off, I'd be able to orient myself and find my way back. That was the plan, at least. But then I heard a voice. "Excuse me? Are you a park ranger?" I jumped to my feet, my hand going to my pepper spray. A man stood at the edge of the clearing, maybe 10 feet away. I hadn't heard him approach. He looked to be in his 40s, wearing hiking clothes and a backpack. His face was hard to make out in the darkness, but his voice sounded friendly, relieved even. "Yes," I said, keeping my distance. "I'm Ranger Morven. Are you lost?" "I think so," he said. "I've been walking for hours and I can't find my campsite. I'm Reuben Caro." He took a step forward, and I instinctively took a step back. Something about him felt wrong, but I couldn't identify what. "Stay where you are," I said firmly. "When did you last know your location?" "This morning," he said. "I set up camp near Silver Creek, right where it meets the main trail. But when I came back from my hike this evening, I couldn't find it. The creek is gone. The trail markers are all wrong, and I've been walking in circles for hours." Silver Creek. That was in the southern sector, miles from where I thought I was. "What time did you start looking for your camp?" "Around 6 p.m. when I got back from hiking Ridge Point." He paused. "What time is it now?" I checked my watch. "It's 2:15 a.m. He was quiet for a moment. "That's not right." "That can't be right. It was just sunset when I started looking, maybe an hour ago." "Mr. Caro, it's been more than 8 hours. You've been out here all night." "No," he said, and I could hear panic creeping into his voice. "No, that's not possible. I would have noticed. I would have known." I understood exactly how he felt. Time was slipping, sliding, becoming unreliable. "Sir, I need you to stay calm. My radio isn't working, but once it's daylight, we'll be able to find our way back. In the meantime, do you have any water, food?" "In my pack," he said. "But I don't understand what's happening. The trails are wrong. The blazes are in different places. I found my footprints from earlier today, but they were facing backward, like I'd been walking the wrong direction." My blood ran cold. "You found backward footprints?" "Yes, my own prints, I'm sure of it. The tread pattern matches my boots, but they were oriented the wrong way, like I'd been walking backward without realizing it." "Where?" I asked urgently. "Where did you see them?" "On the trail near—" He paused, looking around as if trying to get his bearings. "I don't know. Everything looks the same now. The fog is too thick." I moved closer to him, though part of me still wanted to keep my distance. "Mr. Caro, I need to ask you something. When you set up your camp this morning, did you leave anything there? Anything that would help you identify the location?" "My tent, my sleeping bag, all my gear. I just took my day pack for the hike. Everything else should still be there." "And you're certain you set up at Silver Creek?" "Positive. I even took pictures." He swung his backpack off his shoulders and started rummaging through it. "I have my camera here. I can show you." He pulled out a digital camera and turned it on. The small screen glowed in the darkness, and he started scrolling through images. "Here," he said, holding it out to me. "This is my camp this morning." I looked at the photo. It showed a blue tent set up in a small clearing with a creek visible in the background. Trees surrounded the site, and I could see trail markers, white blazes, indicating a connector trail. The timestamp on the photo read November 24th, 6:47 a.m., yesterday morning. "Can I see the next photo?" I asked. He scrolled forward. The next image was similar, another angle of the same campsite. Then a few pictures of the creek itself, the water rushing over rocks. Then shots from a trail, looking up at a mountain ridge, standard hiking photos. "Now scroll backward," I said. "Show me the photos from before you set up camp." He scrolled backward through the images. More trail photos, a sunset shot, an image of him cooking dinner over a camp stove. The timestamp on these was November 23rd. The day before yesterday, he'd been here longer than he thought, but then we reached a photo that made both of us go still. It was an image of his tent, the same blue tent, set up in the same clearing. But the timestamp read November 22nd, 2 days ago. And in this photo, the tent looked weathered, dirty, as if it had been set up for weeks rather than one day. "That's impossible," Reuben whispered. "I just set up yesterday morning. I know I did. I remember doing it." I scrolled backward again. More images of the tent, each with earlier timestamps. November 21st, November 20th. The tent looked progressively more worn in each photo, the clearing more trampled. And in the background of one image I could see something that made my breath catch. A tree with orange flagging tape tied to it. My flagging tape, from a patrol I'd done 3 days ago in the southern sector. "Mr. Caro," I said slowly, "I think you need to check your supplies. Your water, your food. Check and see how much you have left." He opened his pack with shaking hands and pulled out items one by one. A water bottle, almost empty. Food bags, mostly consumed. A propane canister for his stove, nearly depleted. The supplies of someone who'd been camping for at least a week. Not one night. "I don't understand," he said, his voice breaking. "I remember setting up yesterday. I remember eating breakfast, going for a hike, coming back. It was just yesterday." "I believe you," I said. "I believe that's what you remember. But something is happening out here, something that's affecting time, or our perception of it, or—" I trailed off. I didn't know how to finish that sentence. We sat in silence for a moment, both trying to process the impossible. Then Reuben said quietly, "There's something else. Something I didn't want to mention because it sounds crazy. Tell me." When I was looking for my camp, walking through the fog, I saw myself, or someone who looked exactly like me. He was standing on the trail facing backward, and he was— Reuben paused, swallowing hard. He was walking backward, without looking, without stumbling, just walking with perfect confidence in the wrong direction. And when I called out to him, he stopped, turned his head to look at me, but his body didn't turn. His body stayed facing backward, and he smiled. Then he just kept walking backward until the fog swallowed him up. I felt the weight of Reuben's words settle over me like a shroud. His description matched too closely with what I'd experienced. The backward footprints, the impossible movements, the sense that something was watching and mimicking us. "We need to stay together," I said firmly. "Whatever's happening out here, we're safer in pairs. When dawn comes, we'll find our way back." Reuben nodded, looking grateful for the company. We sat on the fallen log together, our flashlights creating a small circle of illumination in the oppressive darkness. The fog continued to shift around us, never quite dissipating but never growing thicker either, maintaining that perfect density that limited visibility to just a few yards. "How long have you been a ranger?" Reuben asked, after a few minutes of silence. I suspected he was trying to distract himself from thinking about his missing time, his impossible memory. 4 years here, 3 years in Montana before that. Ever experience anything like this before? Never. I didn't tell him about the other strange things I'd encountered that night. The disappearing flagging tape, the impossible GPS readings, the camp with the fire that left no ash. He was already frightened enough. We both were, though neither of us wanted to admit it. An hour passed, then another. We took turns keeping watch, though I'm not sure what we thought we were watching for. The forest remained silent. No sounds of animals or wind, or even distant traffic. Just that absolute, suffocating quiet. Around 4 a.m., Reuben stood up suddenly. "Do you hear that?" I listened. At first I heard nothing. Then faintly I caught it, a sound like fabric rustling. It came from somewhere in the fog, moving, circling our position. "Stay close to me," I whispered, pulling out my pepper spray. The sound grew louder, coming from multiple directions now. Not just one source, but several, all moving in a slow, deliberate pattern around us. Then I saw them. Shapes in the fog. Tall, indistinct, moving with an odd, backward gait. 3 of them, maybe 4, it was hard to tell through the mist. They circled us, maintaining a constant distance of about 20 feet, never coming closer but never retreating either. "What are they?" Reuben breathed. "I don't know." One of the shapes stopped directly in front of us, and as I watched, it seemed to solidify slightly. I could make out more details. A human form, wearing hiking clothes, carrying a backpack. It stood facing away from us, but its head was turned at an impossible angle, looking directly at me over its shoulder. "That's me," Reuben said in a strangled voice. "That's me. My jacket, my pack, everything." He was right. The figure was wearing the same clothes Reuben had on, down to the tear in his left sleeve and the patch on his backpack. It was an exact copy, except for the wrong way orientation and that horrible twisted neck. I swept my flashlight to the other figures. There were 4 of them now, and 2 of them wore ranger uniforms. My uniform. They stood in a circle around us, all facing outward, all with their heads turned at that grotesque angle to look at us with blank, expressionless faces. "Don't move," I whispered to Reuben. "Don't engage with them." "What do they want?" "I don't know." The figures began to move again, circling in that backward walk. Their movements were perfectly synchronized, maintaining the exact same distance between each other and maintaining that constant 20-foot radius around us. And as they moved, I realized something that made my blood run cold. They weren't walking on the ground. Their feet were moving, going through the motions of walking, but they hovered about an inch above the earth. No footprints, no disturbance of the fallen leaves, nothing to indicate they had any physical substance. "They're not real," I said, trying to convince myself as much as Reuben. "They can't be real. It's some kind of hallucination, something in the fog, some natural phenomenon we don't understand yet." But even as I said it, I didn't believe it. These things, whatever they were too detailed, too specific. They knew things, what we looked like, what we were wearing, how we moved. They were learning us, studying us, becoming us. The circling continued for what felt like an eternity. My legs ached from standing. My eyes burned from staring into the fog. But I didn't dare look away from those figures. Reuben stood beside me, his breathing rapid and shallow, on the edge of panic. Then, as suddenly as they'd appeared, the figures stopped. They stood in their circle, all facing outward with those twisted necks, and they began to change. It started with their clothes. The colors shifted, bleeding away like watercolors in rain, until they all wore identical gray. Then their faces began to blur, features smoothing out, becoming generic and featureless. Within seconds, they looked less like copies of Reuben and me and more like mannequins, blank and expressionless. "What's happening?" Reuben whispered. "They're losing us. The details are fading." As I watched, the figures began to fade as well, becoming translucent, then nearly invisible. Within a minute, they were gone entirely, dissolved back into the fog as if they'd never existed. We stood in silence for a long moment, neither of us quite believing what we'd just witnessed. "We need to move," I finally said. "Staying in one place makes us too easy to study. We need to keep moving until dawn." Reuben didn't argue. We gathered our things and started walking, choosing a direction at random. Without my GPS or any reliable landmarks, we were essentially navigating blind, but anything was better than sitting still and waiting for those things to return. As we walked, I tried to piece together what was happening. The backward footprints, the shifting trail markers, the time distortion, the mimicking figures. There had to be a pattern, a logic to it all. But the more I thought about it, the more it seemed designed to disorient, to confuse, to make us lose our sense of reality. "I remember something," Reuben said suddenly, "from when I was looking for my camp, before I saw the thing that looked like me. I found a trail marker, a wooden sign pointing toward Silver Creek, but the words on the sign were backward, like mirror writing. I thought my eyes were playing tricks on me, but now you think it was real." "Yes." We walked in silence for a while longer, and slowly, almost imperceptibly, the darkness began to lift. Not sunrise yet, but that subtle lightening that comes in the hour before dawn. The fog started to thin, and I could make out the shapes of trees more clearly. "Look," Reuben said, pointing ahead. "There's a trail marker." Sure enough, there was a wooden post with a sign attached. As we got closer, I could read the text. "Hemlock Ridge Trail, 2.3 miles." We were back where I'd started my patrol, near the beginning of the route where I'd first noticed the wrongly placed blaze. "This is impossible," I said. "We've been walking for hours. We should be miles away from here." But the marker was unmistakable, and as the fog continued to clear, I recognized other landmarks. The distinctive rock formation, the bent pine tree, the old blaze scar from a lightning strike years ago. This was definitely Hemlock Ridge. "At least we know where we are now," Reuben said, trying to sound optimistic. We followed the trail as the sky continued to brighten. The fog was burning off quickly now, retreating back down into the valleys where it would lurk until the next cold night. Colors were returning to the world. The brown of dead leaves, the gray of rocks, the deep green of the few pines that remained among the bare, deciduous trees. We'd been walking for maybe 20 minutes when we saw it. Reuben's camp. It was set up right next to the trail, in a small clearing that definitely hadn't been there during my patrol the previous night. His blue tent, his gear, his fire ring with cold ashes. Everything was there, exactly as he'd described setting it up near Silver Creek. Except we were nowhere near Silver Creek. We were on Hemlock Ridge, miles away from where he thought he'd camped. Reuben walked slowly toward his tent, as if approaching something that might bite. He crouched down and touched the fabric as if confirming it was real. Then he opened the flap and looked inside. "Everything's here," he said quietly. "My sleeping bag, my clothes, everything. But this isn't where I set up. I know it isn't." I walked around the perimeter of the camp, looking for evidence of how it might have been moved, or when it might have been set up, but there were no footprints except Reuben's. The same backward-facing prints I'd seen earlier, leading away from the tent and down the trail. "The ground is wrong," I said, crouching down to examine the earth around the tent. "See this? The compressed area where your tent is sitting? This takes days to form, maybe a week. The grass doesn't flatten like this overnight. But you said you just set up yesterday. Reuben came over to look. His face was pale, drawn. I remember setting up. I remember choosing this spot because it was level, because there was a good view, because the creek was close for water. But there's no creek here. And I remember it so clearly, like it was yesterday. Because it was yesterday, wasn't it? I didn't answer, because I was starting to doubt my own memories as well. Had I really started my patrol just hours ago? Or had it been days? The ache in my legs suggested I'd been walking for much longer than one night. My water bottle was empty, though I couldn't remember drinking it all. My flashlight batteries, which should have lasted at least 6 hours, were nearly dead. Mr. Caro, I said carefully, I think we need to accept that our perceptions of time aren't reliable right now. Something about this place, or this fog, or whatever those things were, it's affecting us, making us lose time, or skip time, or experience time differently than normal. Then how do we know when we'll get out? How do we know if we're moving forward or if we're stuck in some kind of loop? It was a valid question, and I had no answer. The sun was fully up now, bright and warm despite the November cold. The fog was completely gone, and the forest looked normal, mundane even. Just trees and trails and the ordinary beauty of Vermont wilderness. But I knew that appearance was deceptive. Something lived here. Something that waited in the fog and studied the people who walked these trails. We should pack up your gear and head back to the ranger station, I said. Once we're out of the park, once we're around other people, we'll be okay. Reuben nodded and started breaking down his tent. As he worked, I walked a short distance down the trail, looking for any signs of the previous night's strangeness. The blue blazes were where they should be. The rock formation was on the correct side of the trail. Everything was normal, or at least appeared to be. That's when I saw my flagging tape. The orange ribbon I'd tied hours ago, the one that had disappeared, was now visible on a tree about 50 yards down the trail. I walked over to it and examined it closely. It was definitely my tape. I recognized the knot I'd tied, the specific placement, but it wasn't on the tree I'd marked. This was a different tree, in a different location. Or was it? Looking at the tree more carefully, I noticed that distinctive kink in the trunk, the one I'd specifically chosen because it was memorable. This was the same tree, but the tree was in the wrong place, or I was in the wrong place, or the entire forest had somehow shifted during the night. I heard Reuben call out behind me, his voice tight with anxiety. Ranger Morven, you need to see this. I jogged back to where he stood by his disassembled tent. He was holding something in his hands, turning it over slowly. As I got closer, I saw it was a notebook, his trail journal by the look of it. I write in this every day, he said. Record where I hiked, what I saw, the weather, all that. Look at the entries. He opened the notebook and showed me the pages. The handwriting was definitely his, consistent throughout, with the same characteristic loops and crosses. But the entries made no sense. November 22nd. Set up camp at Silver Creek. Weather clear. Hiked to Ridge Point. 8 miles, saw deer tracks. November 22nd. Broke camp. Moved to new site near Hemlock Ridge. Weather foggy. Attempted to hike Ridge Point, but trail markers were wrong. 8 miles, saw deer tracks. November 22nd. Broke camp. Moved back to Silver Creek. Weather foggy. Hiked to Ridge Point. Trail marked correctly now. 8 miles. Saw deer tracks. Every entry was dated November 22nd. Dozens of them filling page after page. Each one describing a slightly different version of the same day, with small variations in details, but all on the same date, as if he'd been living the same day over and over. unaware that he was repeating himself. "I don't remember writing most of these," Reuben said, his voice shaking. "I remember the first one, setting up at Silver Creek. But all these other entries, it's my handwriting, but I don't remember writing them." I flipped to the back of the notebook, looking for any entries after November 22nd. There were none. The pages after the repeated entries were blank. "What day did you arrive at the park?" I asked. "November 22nd. I remember because it was the day after Thanksgiving. I wanted to get away from family obligations, so I drove up here Thursday evening and set up camp on Friday morning. And today is November 27th. His face went white. "That's not possible. I've only been here for 2 days, yesterday and today. According to your journal, you've been here for 5 days. Or rather, you've been living the same day for 5 days." We stood in silence, both trying to process what this meant. Reuben had lost 5 days of his life, repeating the same experiences over and over without realizing it. And if it had happened to him, could it happen to me? Could it already be happening to me? I thought about my patrol routes over the past week. Had I been repeating the same patrol without knowing it? Were there multiple entries in my own logs that I didn't remember making? The thought was terrifying. "We need to leave," I said. "Right now. Pack only what you absolutely need. We're getting out of this forest." Reuben didn't argue. He shoved items into his backpack with shaking hands while I tried to figure out the quickest route back to the ranger station. Without my GPS, I had to rely on memory and the trail markers, but I was no longer confident in either. We started hiking at a fast pace, almost jogging in places. The morning sun was bright and warm, birds were singing, and everything looked so normal that it was hard to believe the horrors of the previous night had actually happened. But Reuben's journal was real. The backward footprints were real. My missing radio and the displaced flagging tape were real. We'd been hiking for maybe an hour when I noticed something that made me stop dead in my tracks. There, on a tree to my left, was a blue blaze. That was normal. Hemlock Ridge was marked with blue blazes. But this blaze was different. It was wet. Fresh paint was dripping down the bark, as if someone had just painted it moments ago. "Did you see anyone else on the trail?" I asked Reuben. "No, no one. You're the first person I've seen since I arrived." I approached the tree cautiously and touched the paint with my finger. It was definitely wet, tacky to the touch. I looked at the surrounding trees and saw more blazes, all freshly painted, all still dripping slightly. Someone had just marked this trail within the last hour, but that was impossible. Trail marking is done during maintenance periods, with advance notice, with teams of workers. It's not something that happens spontaneously, and it's definitely not something that happens in the middle of the morning on a random Tuesday. "The trail is changing," I said quietly. "Being redrawn. That's why nothing looks right, why you couldn't find your camp. The forest is physically changing around us. That's impossible. I know. But look at the paint. It's wet, fresh. Someone or something just marked this trail." We continued walking, faster now, driven by a growing sense of urgency. Every 100 yards or so, we'd pass another wet blaze, more evidence that the trail was being actively marked as we walked it. But we never saw who was doing the marking. We never heard anyone ahead of us or behind us. Then, ahead on the trail, I saw something that made my blood run cold. A figure stood with its back to us, perfectly still. It wore a ranger uniform identical to mine, and it was holding a can of blue paint and a brush. "Don't look at it," I whispered to Reuben. "Just keep walking. Don't acknowledge it." We walked past the figure, keeping our eyes forward. I could feel it watching us, could sense its head turning to follow our movement even though it never moved its body. As we passed, I heard the sound of a paintbrush on bark. Slow, deliberate strokes. It was painting another blaze, adding to the trail that was forming around us. We walked faster, almost running now. Behind us I could hear more brushstrokes, more blazes being added. The trail was forming in our wake, being created by that impossible figure with each step we took. "There!" Reuben shouted, pointing ahead. "I see a road!" He was right. Through the trees, maybe 200 yards ahead, I could see pavement, a strip of black asphalt cutting through the forest. Route 7, the main highway that ran along the western edge of the park. Salvation. We ran, abandoning all pretense of calm. Branches whipped at our faces, roots tried to trip us, but we didn't slow down. The sound of paintbrushes followed us, growing louder, multiplying. Not just one figure marking the trail now, but many. We burst out of the tree line and onto the shoulder of the highway. Cars rushed past, normal people going about their normal lives, oblivious to what lurked in the forest behind us. I'd never been so happy to see traffic in my life. Reuben bent over, hands on his knees, gasping for breath. "We made it," he panted. "We actually made it." I turned to look back at the forest. The tree line looked normal, just bare trees and brown leaves and the ordinary appearance of late November woods. But I could see movement in the shadows, figures standing among the trees, all holding paintbrushes, all watching us with their backward-facing bodies and twisted necks. As I watched, they began to fade, becoming translucent, then invisible. The trail they'd been marking was fading too, the wet paint drying and flaking away, leaving the trees bare again. Within minutes, there was no evidence that any of it had happened. "Come on," I said to Reuben. "Let's flag down a car." It only took a minute before a pickup truck pulled over. The driver, an elderly man with kind eyes, looked concerned when he saw our disheveled appearance. "You folks okay? You look like you've been through hell." "We got lost in the park," I said. "Can you give us a ride to the ranger station? It's about 5 miles south." "Sure thing. Hop in." We climbed into the truck and I felt an overwhelming sense of relief as we pulled away from the forest. I was safe. We were safe. Whatever had happened back there, we'd escaped it. The ranger station was exactly where I remembered it. Solid and real and comfortingly mundane. Tom was at the desk when we walked in, and his eyes widened when he saw us. "Callie? Where the hell have you been? You didn't check in this morning, and we were about to send out a search party." "This morning? What time is it?" Tom looked at the clock on the wall. "Almost 9 a.m. Your shift ended at 6. We expected you back hours ago." I felt my stomach drop. "Tom, what day is it?" He looked at me strangely. "Tuesday, November 27th. Callie, are you okay? You look terrible." "I started my patrol last night. Monday night, November 26th. That's correct, right?" "Yes, Monday night into Tuesday morning. Are you saying you don't remember?" I didn't answer, because I was starting to realize that I couldn't be sure. The memories felt real. Starting my patrol Monday evening, finding the backward footprints, encountering Reuben, the night in the fog. But how much of that was real and how much was distortion? Reuben pulled out his trail journal and showed it to Tom. "Can you look at this and tell me if these entries look normal to you?" Tom flipped through the pages, his expression growing increasingly disturbed. "These are all dated November 22nd. Every single entry. That's not normal." "I know, but I only remember writing the first one." Tom looked at me, then at Reuben, then back at the journal. "I think you both need to sit down and write detailed reports of everything you experienced. And then I need to make some calls. This is beyond anything I've dealt with before." We spent the next several hours writing our reports, trying to capture every detail of what had happened. Reuben's account corroborated mine in most respects, though there were small discrepancies, times that didn't match up, sequences of events that we remembered differently. But the core experiences were the same: the time distortion, the backward footprints, the mimicking figures, the sense that the forest itself was changing around us. When we finished, Tom made a series of phone calls to the park superintendent, to the Forest Service regional office, to someone at a university who apparently specialized in unusual phenomena in wilderness areas. I sat in the break room with a cup of coffee, trying to warm hands that felt like they'd never be warm again. Reuben sat across from me, staring at his journal. "I'm going to burn this," he said quietly. "I don't want to remember any of this. I don't want evidence that it happened." "You should keep it," I said, "for proof, so people believe us. Will they? Would you believe this story if you hadn't lived it?" I didn't have an answer for that. Later that afternoon, Tom came to find me. The park superintendent is temporarily closing the eastern sector. Officially, it's for trail maintenance and safety assessment. Unofficially, well, he's not sure what to do, but he doesn't want anyone else going in there until we figure this out. Has anything like this happened before? Tom hesitated. There have been reports, over the years. Hikers who got disoriented, who lost time, who saw things they couldn't explain. Most of them were dismissed as confusion or hypothermia or panic. But there's a pattern. It always happens in fog. Always in November. And always in that same general area around Hemlock Ridge. Why November? No one knows. Maybe it's the angle of the sun, the temperature differential that creates the fog. Maybe it's something geological, some kind of natural phenomenon we don't understand. Or maybe, he trailed off. Maybe what? Maybe the forest itself is alive in some way we can't comprehend. Maybe it's studying us, learning from us, trying to understand what we are. And maybe, for some people, it learns too well. I thought about those figures in the fog, wearing our faces, walking backward, painting trails that formed and dissolved. If that's true, then what happens when it finishes learning? When it becomes a perfect copy? Tom didn't answer. I never did another night patrol in the eastern sector. Neither did any of the other rangers who heard our story. The area remained officially closed through the rest of November and into December. When it finally reopened in January, after the first heavy snowfall, everything seemed normal. Hikers reported no unusual experiences, no time distortions, no backward footprints. But I notice things now that I didn't before. The way trail markers sometimes seem to be in slightly different positions from one day to the next. The way the forest sounds different in fog, how the silence seems deeper and more absolute. The way my memories of certain patrols don't quite match up with what's in my logbook. And sometimes, late at night, I wonder about those figures we saw. I wonder if they're still out there, waiting in the fog, slowly learning the patterns of every person who walks those trails, learning how to walk, how to talk, how to think like us, learning how to be us. Reuben never came back to Green Mountain National Forest. He sent me an email about a month after the incident, just a brief note saying he'd decided to stick to day hikes in popular, well-traveled areas from now on. He didn't mention the journal or what we'd experienced. I think, like me, he was trying to move on, trying to forget. But I don't think either of us will ever truly forget. Because every time I look in a mirror, every time I see my own reflection, I have to wonder, is that really me? Or is it something that learned how to be me so perfectly that even I can't tell the difference? The forest keeps its secrets. And maybe that's how it should be. Some things aren't meant to be understood, only survived. I still work at Green Mountain National Forest. I still patrol the trails and help lost hikers and maintain the facilities. But I never walk alone in fog anymore, and I never ever look back to check if something is following me, because deep down, I'm afraid I might see myself walking there, facing backward, painting the trail as I go. My name is John Mercer, and I've been doing search and rescue work in Green Mountain National Forest for the better part of 6 years. Before that, I spent 8 years in the Coast Guard, so I'm no stranger to emergency situations, or the strange things that can happen when you're trying to find someone who doesn't want to be found, or can't be found. Most SAR operations follow a predictable pattern. Someone gets lost or injured, we get a call, we organize a search grid, and within a few hours we locate them. Maybe they're dehydrated, maybe they've got a twisted ankle, but they're alive and we bring them home. It's methodical work, often tedious, but it's important. Lives depend on it. What happened during the Densmore search was different. It broke every pattern I'd learned, violated every assumption I'd made about how reality works in the wilderness. And it started with a voice that cut off mid-sentence, as if someone had hit pause on a recording. The call came in on a Thursday afternoon in early December. A solo hiker named Laura Densmore had failed to check in with her sister after a planned 3-day backpacking trip. The sister had waited an extra day before calling, hoping Laura had just lost track of time or decided to extend her trip. But when Friday came and went with no word, she contacted the Park Service. I was assigned as lead coordinator for the search. Laura's car was still at the trailhead where she'd left it on Tuesday morning, and according to the logbook at the ranger station, she'd planned to hike the Northern Loop, a moderate 15-mile circuit that most experienced hikers could complete in 2 days. We assembled a team of 8. Myself, 3 other SAR specialists, 2 park rangers, and 2 volunteers with tracking experience. The weather was cold but clear, with temperatures in the mid-30s and no precipitation forecast. Good conditions for a search. We set out at first light on Saturday, following Laura's intended route. She'd be 3 days overdue by now, which wasn't necessarily critical if she had adequate supplies and shelter, but it was long enough to be concerning. December in Vermont can be unforgiving, especially at night when temperatures drop below freezing. The first few miles of the trail showed clear evidence of recent use. We found boot prints that matched the sole pattern of Laura's hiking boots. Her sister had provided us with a photo. The prints were well defined in patches of soft ground, and they followed the trail exactly. No signs of stumbling, no erratic movement that might indicate injury or disorientation. She'd been walking with purpose, at least initially. Around mile 4, we found her first overnight camp. The site was clean. She'd followed Leave No Trace principles, packing out all her trash and dispersing the ashes from her fire. But there was something odd about the placement. The tent compression marks in the earth showed she'd set up facing north, with her tent door pointing toward the trail. That's backwards from what most experienced hikers do. You typically want your door facing away from the trail for privacy. Could just be personal preference, said Martinez, one of my SAR team members. Some people like to be able to see the trail. Maybe, I said, but it bothered me in a way I couldn't quite articulate. We marked the location with GPS and continued following her trail. The boot prints led away from the campsite and back onto the main trail, heading north toward the high point of the loop. Everything still looked normal, routine. Then we reached the junction. The northern loop has a fork at about mile 7, where hikers can choose to take either the ridge route or the valley route. Both paths eventually reconnect, but the ridge route is more exposed and strenuous while the valley route is gentler but longer. According to Laura's filed trip plan, she'd intended to take the ridge route. but her boot prints went down the valley path. She changed her mind, Martinez said. Happens all the time. Weather looked different than expected, or she was more tired than she thought. That made sense. But as I stood at the junction, I noticed something else. There was a trail marker at the fork, a wooden post with directional signs. The paint on the Ridge Route sign looked fresh, newer than the paint on the Valley Route sign. And when I examined it more closely, I could see that the wood grain of the post was oriented differently on the top versus the bottom, as if the sign had been removed and replaced, but not quite aligned properly. "Something's off here," I said to Martinez. "What do you mean?" "This sign. Look at the wood grain. See how it doesn't line up?" He peered at it, then shrugged. "Maintenance, probably. They replace sections that get weather damage." Maybe. But maintenance on trail signs was supposed to be logged, and I hadn't seen any reports of work being done in this sector recently. We took the valley route, following Lara's prints. The trail descended gradually into a shallow ravine where a small creek ran over moss-covered rocks. The temperature dropped noticeably as we entered the ravine. The sun couldn't penetrate here, and cold air pooled in the low-lying area. That's where we found the first flag. It was a piece of bright orange surveyor's tape, tied to a branch at about eye level. The kind of marker SAR teams use to mark their path when searching off-trail. But we hadn't put it there, and we were the only active search operation in the area. "Did Lara have flagging tape?" Martinez asked. I checked the gear list her sister had provided. "No, just standard hiking equipment, no navigation markers. Maybe another hiker left it," one of the rangers suggested. "People do that sometimes when they go off trail, even though they're not supposed to." We continued forward and found another flag about 50 yards later. Then another. They formed a trail leading off the main path into dense forest where there was no established route. "Should we follow it?" Martinez asked. I hesitated. Protocol said we should stay on established trails unless we had specific evidence that the missing person had gone off trail. But those flags were fresh, probably placed within the last few days, and Lara was missing. We follow, I decided, but everyone stays together. No one wanders off alone. We marked our departure point with GPS and began following the orange flags. They led us deeper into the forest, weaving between trees, occasionally skirting around dense undergrowth. Whoever placed them knew what they were doing. The route was passable, clearly chosen to minimize difficulty. After about a quarter mile, we found another campsite. This one was occupied. A tent sat in a small clearing, a blue backpacking tent that looked relatively new. Smoke rose from a fire ring, suggesting the fire had been burning within the last hour or so, but there was no one there. "Hello?" I called out. "This is search and rescue. We're looking for a missing hiker. Anyone here?" No response. The forest was absolutely silent. No birds, no wind, nothing. Just that eerie quiet that sometimes descends on wilderness areas for no apparent reason. We approached the tent cautiously. "Hello? Park Service, we're coming into your camp." Still no response. I crouched down and looked through the mesh window on the tent. Inside, I could see a sleeping bag, a backpack, and various camping equipment, but no person. "Martinez, check the perimeter. See if you can find tracks leading away from camp." While he searched, I examined the camp more closely. The fire in the ring was down to coals, but I could feel heat when I held my hand near it. Definitely recent. There was a pot sitting on a flat rock near the fire, still containing what looked like instant oatmeal. I touched the side of the pot, still warm. Someone had been here within the last half hour, maybe less. They'd been in the middle of eating breakfast when they left. But why, and where had they gone? Martinez returned, shaking his head. no tracks. I circled the entire clearing, went out about 50 feet in every direction. There's no indication anyone walked away from this camp. That's impossible. Someone set up this tent, made that fire, cooked that food. They didn't just vanish into thin air. I'm telling you, there are no tracks. The ground cover is soft enough that boot prints would show clearly, but there's nothing. Just the trail we made coming in. I stood up slowly, a familiar prickle of unease running down my spine. This was wrong, all of it. The misaligned trail sign, the mysterious flagging tape, the occupied camp with no occupant and no way for them to have left. "We need to check the tent," I said. "See if there's any identification." I unzipped the tent flap and carefully looked inside, making sure not to disturb anything more than necessary. The backpack was sitting against the back wall and I could see a name tag on it. Laura Densmore. My blood ran cold. This is her tent. This is Laura's camp. But that made no sense. Why would she leave her gear, her food, her shelter? It was December in Vermont. Leaving your tent in these conditions was tantamount to suicide. "Maybe she's answering nature's call," one of the rangers suggested. "Just stepped away for a minute?" Without leaving tracks, we waited. 5 minutes, then 10, then 15. No one appeared. The forest remained silent, that unnatural quiet pressing in from all sides. "Lara?" I called out. "Lara Densmore, this is search and rescue. If you can hear me, please respond." My voice seemed to die in the air, absorbed by the trees and the silence. No echo, no response, nothing. Then I heard it. A voice, faint but clear, coming from somewhere deeper in the forest. "John, John, is that?" And then it stopped. Not faded, not was interrupted by another sound. It just stopped, cutting off mid-word as if someone had hit pause. The silence that followed was absolute. "Did you hear that?" I asked the team. "Hear what?" Martinez said. "The voice. Someone said my name. They said, 'John, is that?' And then it cut off." The team looked at each other. "We didn't hear anything," Martinez said slowly. "Are you sure?" I was sure. The voice had been clear, distinct, coming from the northeast. "Everyone stay here. I'm going to check it out." "John, protocol says we stay together." "I know, but if that was Lara, if she's injured and can't move, she might not be able to call out again. Give me 10 minutes. If I'm not back, or you don't hear from me on the radio, come find me." Before anyone could argue further, I headed in the direction the voice had come from. I moved quickly but carefully, my radio in one hand and my flashlight in the other, even though it was still daylight. The trees here were dense, primarily evergreens that blocked out much of the sun. I'd gone maybe 100 yards when I heard it again. "John? John, is that?" Same voice, same words, cutting off at exactly the same point, like a recording being played. But it was definitely closer this time, maybe 50 feet ahead. "Lara, keep calling out. I'm coming to you." I pushed forward through a dense patch of undergrowth and emerged into another small clearing. And there, sitting on a fallen log with her back to me, was a figure wearing a blue jacket and a backpack. "Lara?" I called out. The figure didn't move, didn't respond. I approached slowly, my hand moving instinctively toward the pepper spray on my belt. Something was wrong. The posture was too rigid, too still. "Lara Densmore, I'm John Mercer, search and rescue. I'm here to help you." I walked around the log to see the person's face. There was no one there. The log was empty, but I could still see the depression in the wood where someone had been sitting. Could see the slight disturbance in the pine needles on the ground where feet had rested. Someone had been here moments ago. "John, John, is that?" The voice came from behind me now, back the way I'd come. I spun around, but the forest was empty, just trees and undergrowth and that oppressive silence. My radio crackled. "John, this is Martinez. You okay? You've been gone 12 minutes. I keyed the radio. "Yeah, I'm fine. I'm coming back. But something weird is happening out here." I made my way back to Lara's camp where the team was waiting. They looked relieved to see me, but also concerned. "Find anything?" Martinez asked. "No, but I keep hearing a voice calling my name. Same words, cutting off at the same point. Like a recording, and I saw someone, or I thought I did, but when I got close there was no one there." The team exchanged worried glances. "John," Martinez said carefully, "maybe you should sit down for a minute. When's the last time you ate, slept properly?" "I'm fine. I'm not hallucinating. I know what I heard." "We believe you," one of the rangers said. "But we didn't hear anything. None of us did." That stopped me. If the voice was real, why was I the only one who could hear it? Unless, what if it's directed, I said. What if the sound is somehow being focused, like a narrow beam, so only I can hear it? "That's not how sound works," Martinez said gently. "I know, but nothing about this situation makes sense. Lara's gear is here, but she's not. There are no tracks leading away from camp. I heard her voice calling my name, but it cuts off mid-sentence every time. And now I'm seeing figures that disappear when I get close." We decided to expand the search pattern, moving in a wider circle around Lara's camp. The team split into pairs, each group covering a different quadrant. I was paired with Martinez, and we took the eastern sector. As we walked, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. The forest seemed to close in around us, the trees pressing closer than they should. Rationally, I knew this was just my mind playing tricks after the stress of the situation, but the feeling persisted. "John," Martinez said after we'd been walking for about 15 minutes. "Look at this." He was pointing at a tree, a large oak with distinctive bark patterns. Someone had carved initials into the trunk, LD plus MS, inside a rough heart shape. The carving looked recent, the exposed wood still pale. "Lara Densmore," I said. "The LD has to be her. But who's MS? Maybe she came up here with someone? A boyfriend or girlfriend her sister didn't know about. Possible, but there was only one car at the trailhead, and her trip plan said solo hiking." We marked the location with GPS and continued searching. The initials bothered me. If Lara had come up here with someone else, that changed the entire dynamic of the search. It could mean 2 people were missing, or it could mean she'd met someone in the forest, someone who might not have her best interests at heart. We were about to turn back and regroup with the team when Martinez grabbed my arm. "Do you see that?" About 30 yards ahead, there was another flash of orange. More surveyor's tape, hanging from a branch. But this tape was different. It was tied in a distinctive pattern, a series of knots that looked deliberate, almost ritualistic. "That's not standard flagging technique," Martinez said. "Someone's trying to send a message." We approached the tape carefully. As we got closer, I realized it wasn't just tied in knots. There was something carved into the tree bark beneath it. Letters, crudely scratched but legible. "Wrong way, turn back now." "Well, that's not ominous at all," Martinez muttered. "Question is, who left this message? Lara or someone else? And turn back from what? We're not even on a trail anymore." He was right. Somewhere in the last 10 minutes of walking, we'd lost any semblance of a trail. We were in deep forest now, navigating by GPS and landmarks alone. I pulled out my radio. "This is Mercer. Martinez and I found another marker, but this one has a warning carved into the tree. Says, 'Wrong way, turn back now.' GPS coordinates are... I read off our position, requesting advice on whether to proceed or return to base camp. There was a long pause before the response came, but when it did, it wasn't the voice of one of my team members. It was a woman's voice, distorted by static. "John? John, is that..." The transmission cut off with a sharp burst of static. Martinez and I looked at each other. "Was that..." he started. "On the radio? Yeah, that was the voice I've been hearing. But that's impossible. No one else is on this frequency. It's a dedicated SAR channel." I tried calling back. "This is Mercer. Someone just transmitted on this frequency. Identify yourself." Only static responded. We stood there in the forest, the warning carved into the tree behind us. Neither of us quite willing to voice what we were both thinking. Something was very wrong with this search operation. "We should head back," Martinez finally said. "Regroup with the team, figure out our next move." I nodded, and we started making our way back toward Lara's camp. But as we walked, I noticed something that made me stop. "Martinez, look at that tree." I pointed to an oak about 20 feet to our left. It had a distinctive split trunk, creating a V shape. I was certain I'd seen this tree before. I'd specifically noted it as a landmark when we'd been walking. "What about it?" Martinez asked. "The split, the V. It's facing south now, but when we passed it earlier it was facing north. I remember because I was using it to orient myself." Martinez walked over to the tree and examined it. "John, trees don't rotate. This is probably a different tree that looks similar." "No, look at the base. See that patch of moss? That specific pattern? This is the same tree, I'm certain of it." "Then you remembered the orientation wrong. It's easy to get turned around in the forest." But I knew I wasn't wrong. That tree had been facing north, the split pointing toward the direction we'd been walking. Now it was facing south, as if the entire tree had rotated 180 degrees. We continued back toward camp, but the feeling of disorientation was growing stronger. Landmarks I'd noted on the way out seemed to be in different positions. Distances felt wrong. Places that should have been close seemed far away, and vice versa. "Are we lost?" Martinez asked, after we'd been walking for 20 minutes with no sign of the camp. "We shouldn't be. We've only been gone 40 minutes total. The camp is less than half a mile from where we found that warning." I checked my GPS unit and my stomach dropped. According to the satellite reading, we were now almost 2 miles from Lara's camp. But that was impossible. We'd been walking in a straight line, back the way we came. We couldn't have covered 2 miles in 20 minutes, especially not through dense forest. "The GPS must be malfunctioning," I said. "Solar interference or something." But even as I said it, I knew it was unlikely. GPS units are remarkably reliable, and the sky was clear. No reason for signal interference. Martinez pulled out his own GPS unit and checked it. His reading matched mine. We were somehow 2 miles away from where we should be. "Okay," Martinez said, his voice tight with barely controlled anxiety. "Okay, let's just follow the GPS back to camp. Forget landmarks, forget our sense of direction. We follow the unit." We started walking in the direction the GPS indicated, but with each step, the distance to camp seemed to increase rather than decrease. After 10 minutes of walking, we were supposedly 3 miles away, then 4, then 5. "This is insane," Martinez said. "We're walking toward it, but we're getting farther away. How is that possible?" I stopped walking and looked around. The forest looked the same in every direction: dense, dark, oppressive. No distinguishing features, no landmarks, just an endless repetition of trees and undergrowth. Then I heard it again. That voice cutting through the silence. "John, John, is that... Did you hear it that time?" I asked Martinez. I heard something, but it wasn't clear, like like a recording being played in the distance, so he could hear it now. Whatever was generating that sound, it was getting stronger, or we were getting closer to the source. John? John, is that? It was definitely louder now, and I realized something about the voice that made my skin crawl. It was calling my name, but it wasn't asking a question. The tone was flat, emotionless, like someone reading words off a page without understanding their meaning. "We need to find the source of that voice," I said. "Whatever's going on here, that's the center of it. John, maybe we should—" "John? John, is that—" The voice interrupted Martinez, speaking at the exact same moment he started his sentence. And now I could tell where it was coming from. Not from a direction exactly, but from everywhere and nowhere at once, like it was part of the forest itself. We stood back to back, scanning the trees for any sign of movement. The voice continued, repeating that same truncated sentence every 30 seconds or so. With each repetition, it grew louder, more insistent. Then I saw her. Lara Densmore stood about 40 feet away, partially obscured by trees. She wore the same blue jacket I'd seen in the photo her sister had provided. She was facing away from us, head tilted at an odd angle, as if listening to something we couldn't hear. "Lara?" I called out. "Lara Densmore?" She didn't respond, didn't move, just stood there perfectly still, her head tilted in that unnatural position. I started toward her, but Martinez grabbed my arm. "John, wait. Something's not right. She's right there. We found her. That's what we came here to do. Look at her feet." I looked. Lara was standing in a patch of soft ground, muddy from recent rain. But there were no footprints. No impressions in the mud, no disturbance of the ground cover around her feet. She was standing there, but leaving no evidence of her presence. "Lara?" I tried again. "We're search and rescue. We're here to help you." Slowly, impossibly slowly, her head began to turn. Not her body, just her head, rotating to face us. And as it turned, I realized with growing horror that it was turning too far, past the point where a neck should stop, past the point of human flexibility. When she was facing us, I saw that her eyes were open but empty, her expression blank, and her mouth moved, forming words that came out in that same flat, emotionless tone. "John? John, is that—" The sentence cut off, and her mouth snapped shut with an audible click. Then her head began to rotate again, turning back to face forward. Once it was in its original position, she started walking, moving deeper into the forest with a stiff, mechanical gait. "Follow her," I heard myself say, though every instinct was screaming at me to run in the opposite direction. "Are you insane?" Martinez hissed. "That's not Lara. That's not even human. Whatever it is, it might lead us to the real Lara, or at least to answers." We followed at a safe distance, trying to make as little noise as possible. The figure moved through the forest without hesitation, never looking back, never deviating from its path. It didn't avoid obstacles. It walked straight through dense undergrowth as if it wasn't there, emerging on the other side without a scratch or torn fabric. After about 10 minutes, it stopped at the edge of a small clearing, and in the center of that clearing, I saw something that made my blood run cold. There were more of them. Dozens of them. Figures standing in perfect concentric circles, all facing inward toward a single tree in the center. They all wore hiking clothes, all stood in that same rigid posture. And they all looked like different people, different heights, different builds, different clothing. Each one unique, but all sharing that same blank expression, that same unnatural stillness. The Lara figure walked into the clearing and took her place in one of the outer circles, slotting into a gap between two other figures as if she'd always been meant to stand there. "What the hell are we looking at?" Martinez whispered. Before I could answer, all of the figures spoke in unison. Different voices, different names, but all following the same pattern. John, John, is that Sarah? Sarah, are you Mike? Mike, can you Amy? Amy, please. Dozens of voices, all cutting off mid-sentence, all asking incomplete questions. And with each repetition, the voices grew louder, more insistent, until they merged into a cacophony of desperate, truncated calls. Then, as suddenly as they'd started, they all stopped. The silence that followed was absolute, suffocating. And in that silence, something began to emerge from behind the central tree. It looked human at first glance. Tall, maybe 6.5 feet, wearing clothes that seemed to shift and change even as I looked at them. Sometimes hiking gear, sometimes a ranger uniform, sometimes civilian clothes. But the face was wrong in ways I couldn't quite process. Features that seemed to slide and reform, never settling into a consistent configuration. The figure walked to the center of the clearing, and all of the standing figures turned their heads in unison to watch it. The sound of dozens of necks rotating simultaneously made me want to vomit. "We need to leave," Martinez breathed. "Now. We need to get out of here right now." But I was transfixed, unable to move. The central figure had stopped and was looking directly at us, even though we were hidden behind trees at the edge of the clearing. Its eyes, if they were eyes, seemed to see through the vegetation, through the very air between us. Then it spoke, and its voice was a perfect amalgamation of every voice we'd heard. Male and female, young and old, familiar and strange, all layered together into something that should have been noise but somehow resolved into clear speech. "You came looking for one. You found many. Are you satisfied?" I found my voice, though it came out as barely a whisper. "Where is Lara Densmore, the real one?" "Here, there, everywhere." She walked into the forest, and the forest welcomed her. She scattered like seeds on the wind. Now she stands in circles, calling out for help that will never come. That's not an answer, isn't it? You asked where she is. I told you. She is in many places at once, fragmented across this space like light through a prism. One becomes many, many become one. Martinez was tugging on my jacket, trying to pull me away, but I couldn't move. Some part of my mind understood that if I ran, if I turned my back on this thing, something terrible would happen. "What are you?" I asked. The figure tilted its head, too far, like all the others. "I am the space between heartbeats, the pause between words, the silence in the signal. I am what happens when you call out and receive no answer, when you speak and are not heard, when you exist but leave no mark. That's not an answer either. You want answers that fit your understanding, but your understanding is too small, too limited. You see linearity when there is only recursion. You see individuals when there is only pattern. You see time when there is only repetition." The standing figures began to move, all turning to face us now. Dozens of blank faces, dozens of tilted heads, all fixed on our position with that same empty stare. "Run," Martinez said. "John, we have to run." This time I listened. We turned and fled, crashing through the undergrowth without any regard for stealth or direction. Behind us, I could hear footsteps, many footsteps, moving in perfect synchronization. The figures were following, maintaining their formation even as they pursued us. "John, John, is that—" The voices started again, all of them calling out at once. But now they were using different names, names I recognized. My team members, my family, people I'd known years ago, all calling out in that same truncated pattern, questions that would never be completed. We ran for what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes. My lungs burned, my legs ached, but fear kept me moving. The footsteps behind us never grew closer, but they never grew more distant either. They maintained a constant presence, just out of sight, perfectly coordinated. Then suddenly, we burst out of the trees and onto an established trail. I recognized it immediately. The valley route of the northern loop, where we'd started following Lara's tracks what felt like days ago, but had probably only been a few hours. The footsteps stopped. I looked back at the tree line, but there was nothing there. Just forest, normal and mundane in the afternoon light. No figures, no voices, no evidence that any of what we'd experienced had been real. Martinez bent over, hands on his knees, gasping for breath. Was that actually... Yeah, I managed. Yeah, that happened. We stood there for several minutes, trying to catch our breath and process what we'd witnessed. Then Martinez pulled out his radio. "This is Martinez. Mercer and I are back on the Valley Trail, about 2 miles from Lara Densmore's last known camp. We need immediate extraction. All teams pull back to the trailhead. Say again, all teams pull back. This search is suspended." The response came back immediately, but it wasn't what I expected. "Martinez, this is base. Negative on your last. All teams checked in 15 minutes ago. You're the last ones out. What took you so long?" Martinez and I looked at each other in confusion. "What do you mean, we're the last ones? We've only been separated from the team for maybe 2 hours. Negative. It's been 7 hours since you last checked in. We've been trying to raise you on the radio for the past 3 hours. Where have you been?" 7 hours. We'd lost 7 hours somehow. Time that had passed for everyone else, but not for us. Or maybe it had passed for us, but we'd experienced it differently, compressed or expanded in ways that violated every law of physics I understood. "We're coming back to the trailhead," I said into the radio. "We'll debrief there, but this search is over. We're not finding Lara Densmore, not like this." We walked back along the trail in silence, both of us too shaken to speak. The forest around us looked normal, peaceful even. Birds were singing, wind rustled through the branches, sunlight filtered through the bare trees. No indication of the horror that lurked just off the beaten path. When we reached the trailhead, the rest of the team was waiting. They looked worried, but not panicked, clearly not understanding the severity of what Martinez and I had experienced. "Where were you?" asked one of the rangers. "We've been trying to reach you for hours. We found something," I said carefully. "Something that can't be explained with normal search and rescue procedures." I described what we'd seen. The camp with no tracks, the voice that cut off mid-sentence, the figures standing in circles, the thing in the center that spoke in layered voices. As I talked, I watched their faces shift from concern to skepticism to outright disbelief. "John," one of them finally said, "I think you need to sit down. You might be suffering from exhaustion or—" "I saw it too," Martinez interrupted. "Everything he's describing, I witnessed it. The figures, the voices, all of it. This isn't exhaustion or hallucination. Something is out there." The team exchanged glances. "Okay," the ranger said slowly. "Let's say we believe you. What do you want us to do? We can't just abandon a search because you saw something strange." "That's exactly what we're doing," I said firmly. "This search is suspended as of now. We're not sending anyone else into that forest. We need to at least recover Lara's gear, her tent, her backpack. It's evidence now. This is no longer just a missing person case. We need to contact the state police, possibly the FBI. Let them handle it." It took another hour of debate, but eventually I convinced them. We packed up our equipment and headed back to the ranger station, where I filed the most bizarre incident report of my career. The park superintendent read it with increasing concern, occasionally glancing up at me as if trying to determine whether I'd lost my mind. "You understand how this sounds," he finally said. "I know, but it's the truth. Martinez will corroborate everything. And you want me to close the northern sector of the park based on this report?" "Yes, at least until we can organize a proper investigation with the right resources." He thought about it for a long moment, then sighed. "I'll make some calls. But John, if this turns out to be some kind of stress-induced hallucination, if we close part of the park and find nothing unusual, your career in search and rescue is over. You understand that?" "I understand." The park superintendent made his calls, and within 2 days a team arrived from the FBI's Unusual Phenomena Division. I didn't even know such a division existed, but apparently incidents like ours were more common than the public knew. They spent a week searching the northern sector, focusing on the areas where Martinez and I had encountered the figures. They found Lara's tent, exactly where we'd reported it, but all of her personal items were gone. No backpack, no gear, nothing that would identify the camp as hers. And when they examined the tent more closely, they discovered something disturbing. The fabric was old, weathered, as if it had been sitting there for years rather than days. Carbon dating later confirmed the material was at least 15 years old, despite Lara's sister insisting the tent had been purchased new just 3 months earlier. They found the tree with the carved warning, but the carving was almost completely grown over, as if decades had passed since someone had scratched those letters into the bark. They found the clearing where we'd seen the figures standing in circles, but the ground showed no evidence of any footsteps or disturbance, just undisturbed forest floor, looking like no one had walked there in years. And they found something else. In the center of the clearing, at the base of that central tree, there was a small metal plaque. It was heavily oxidized, almost unreadable, but with some work they managed to make out the text. "In memory of the lost voices, 19/7/2024, they called out but were not heard." That was next year. The plaque was dated for something that hadn't happened yet. Or maybe it had happened, in some way that didn't align with our linear understanding of time. The FBI team spent another week investigating, taking samples, conducting interviews, analyzing data. Then they packed up their equipment and left without providing any conclusions or explanations. The northern sector remained closed, officially designated as under investigation for environmental anomalies. I never went back to that forest. Neither did Martinez. We both requested transfers to different parks, different states even. Some things, once you've seen them, you can't unsee. Some places, once you've been there, leave marks on you that never fully fade. But sometimes, late at night when everything is quiet, I hear it, that voice cutting off mid-sentence. Sometimes it's calling my name. Sometimes it's calling other names, people I know, people I've lost contact with over the years. And I wonder if somewhere, in some forest, in some clearing filled with standing figures, there's a version of me calling out, asking questions that will never be answered, existing in the space between words, the silence and the signal. The official report listed Lara Densmore as missing, presumed lost. Her family held a memorial service 6 months later, but her body was never found, and no one could explain what happened to her in those woods. I think I know, though. I think she's still there, in that clearing, standing in one of those circles, calling out for help in a voice that cuts off before it can be fully heard. One among many, fragmented like light through a prism, lost in the space between heartbeats, existing but leaving no mark. And sometimes I wonder, when I die, will I end up there too? Standing in a circle, my head tilted at an unnatural angle, calling out to whoever comes searching for me. repeating the same truncated question for eternity, trying to complete a thought that will never be finished? I don't know. And honestly, I don't want to find out. The northern sector of Green Mountain National Forest remains closed. If you ever find yourself hiking in Vermont, if you see orange flagging tape leading off an established trail, don't follow it. If you hear someone calling your name in the forest, don't answer. And if you come across a clearing filled with standing figures, all facing inward toward a central tree, run. Run and don't look back. Because some searches should never be completed. Some lost should stay lost. And some voices should be allowed to cut off mid-sentence, their questions forever unanswered. 3 years have passed since that search operation. I work in Colorado now, in a completely different forest system, doing completely different work. Day hikes only, no overnight operations. I told myself I was making a practical career choice, but the truth is I can't handle the darkness anymore. Can't handle the silence that comes after sunset in the deep woods. Martinez moved to Florida. Last I heard, he was working as a marina manager, as far from forest as he could get. We don't talk about what happened. When we occasionally exchange emails, it's about weather, sports, mundane things. Neither of us wants to acknowledge what we witnessed. But last month, something happened that I can't ignore. I received a package at my ranger station. No return address, just a postmark from Vermont. Inside was a digital camera. Laura Densmore's camera, the one she'd been carrying when she disappeared. And a note, written in block letters. They wanted you to see. I almost threw it away. Almost took it straight to the authorities without looking. But I couldn't help myself. I turned it on, and there were hundreds of photos. Most were normal hiking pictures, trails, mountains, campsites, standard wilderness photography. But the last 50 photos were different. They showed the clearing, the figures standing in circles, and they were all dated after Laura's official disappearance date, November 30th, December 3rd, December 10th. The timestamps went on for weeks, months. The most recent photo was dated just 2 weeks ago. In that final image, there was a new figure in the outer circle. It was wearing a park ranger uniform. My uniform. The face was turned away from the camera, but I could see a name tag on the chest. I couldn't make out the letters clearly, but I knew what it said. My name. I destroyed the camera that same day. Smashed it with a rock until it was nothing but plastic fragments and circuit board pieces. Then I burned the pieces and scattered the ashes. I told myself it was a hoax, someone's sick idea of a joke. But the photos looked real. The metadata checked out. And deep in my gut, I knew the truth. Somewhere in that forest, in that clearing, there's a version of me standing in a circle, calling out questions that will never be answered. And maybe, one day, I'll walk into those woods and find myself looking at myself, and I won't be able to tell which one is real anymore. The thing that terrifies me most? Sometimes, when I'm alone, when everything is quiet, I feel my head start to tilt. Just slightly. Just that first degree of rotation toward an angle that necks shouldn't reach. And I have to physically grab my head with both hands, force it straight, remind myself which way is forward and which way is back. I'm starting to forget, and I think that's the point. Yesterday, I found myself standing in the forest near my Colorado Ranger station. I don't remember walking there. One moment I was at my desk filling out equipment requisition forms, and the next I was 2 miles into the woods, standing perfectly still, facing a tree. My head was tilted. Not all the way, not to that impossible angle, but tilted, and I was silent, completely silent, not even breathing loudly. Just standing there, waiting. When I realized where I was, what I was doing, I ran back to the station so fast I thought my lungs would burst. I told my supervisor I was sick, went home early. Spent the rest of the day sitting on my couch with every light in the apartment turned on, my hands gripping my head, forcing it to stay straight. I can't tell anyone about this. Who would believe me? I'd be put on medical leave, probably forced into psychiatric evaluation. They'd think it was PTSD from the failed search operation, some kind of trauma response, and maybe that's all it is. Maybe I'm just losing my mind in a completely mundane, scientifically explainable way. But I don't think so, because this morning I found orange flagging tape in my closet. 3 pieces of it tied with those same distinctive knots I saw in Vermont. I live alone. I haven't been hiking in months. There is no reason for that tape to be in my apartment. I also found something else. A trail log, the kind we use to record patrol routes and observations. It was sitting on my kitchen table when I woke up. The handwriting is mine. I'm absolutely certain of it. But I don't remember writing it. The entries are all dated for today, but they describe events that haven't happened yet. Things I'm supposedly going to do, places I'm supposedly going to go. And the final entry, written in my handwriting but in letters that get progressively more shaky and distorted, says, "Found the clearing, the circles. They were waiting. I took my place in the outer ring. It feels right here. It feels like home. The questions are forming in my throat, building up pressure. Soon I'll speak them. Soon I'll call out. And someone will hear me. And someone will come searching. And someone will find me standing here, and the pattern will continue. The pattern must continue. We are the space between words. We are the silence in the signal. We are..." And then it cuts off. Mid-sentence. Just like the voices. I burned that logbook, same as I did with the camera. But I can feel the words still there, lodged in my throat like something physical. The questions that want to be asked. The incomplete sentences that need to be spoken. At night, I dream of the clearing. The figures standing in their perfect circles. And there's an empty space in the outer ring. A gap that's exactly my size, exactly my shape, waiting for me to fill it. I've started making plans to leave Colorado. Maybe move to a city, somewhere without forests, without wilderness, without trees. Maybe if I surround myself with concrete and crowds and constant noise, I can drown out whatever is calling to me. But I know, deep down, that it won't matter. Geography is irrelevant. The clearing isn't really a place. It's a state of being, a frequency you tune into. And once you've heard the signal, once you've stood in those woods and witnessed what exists in the spaces between, you can never fully leave. Martinez hasn't responded to my last 3 emails. I called his number, but it's been disconnected. I tried reaching out to his family, but they say they haven't heard from him in weeks. He left his job at the marina without notice, just walked away one day and never came back. I think I know where he went. I think I know where I'm going too. The question is, when I arrive at that clearing, when I take my place in the outer circle, will I know I'm there? Or will I, like Lara, like all the others, think I'm still searching, still trying to find my way out, still calling for help that will never come?